Peter Baelish stood on the cold battlements of the Eyrie, eyes fixed on the breathtaking panorama of the Vale. A cloak of night was embracing the jagged mountaintops, the sky a tapestry of stars that flickered like secrets longing to be told. Wind buffeted the high parapets, carrying with it a whisper of winter from the distant north. In that hush he made his decision. For too long, he had nurtured his own ambitions, weaving intricate plots with the single-minded determination of a spider building a web. Yet somewhere in that vast labyrinth of alliances and betrayals, new doubts had begun to pierce his cunning mind. Perhaps it was the haunted look in Sansa Stark's eyes that had unsettled him. Perhaps it was the memory of her mother, Catelyn, to whom he had once pledged a hopelessly youthful devotion. Or perhaps it was a fleeting sense that his own cunning had led him to a precarious precipice, where all could come crashing down in an instant. He had not planned this change of heart. Peter Baelish was not in the habit of conceding ground to sentiment. But something had shifted during those long nights in the Eyrie. He had seen Sansa Stark's resilience unfold before him, like a winter rose surviving the frost. She was no longer a frightened child. She was learning, observing, and above all, she was forging herself into something formidable. Sansa had endured King's Landing. She had witnessed her father's death, survived Joffrey's sadism, and escaped the clutches of enemies wearing the skin of allies. Through it all, her poise had deepened, her clarity sharpened. Littlefinger recognized a queen in the making, and for the first time in his life, he felt the stirrings of a genuine desire to protect another soul, not merely to use them as a stepping stone. He knew, too, that the storm rising in the north could not be ignored. House Bolton clutched the ruins of Winterfell in its red hands, flaying traitors and terrorizing those who should have pledged fealty to House Stark. The wild rumor was that Sansa's sister Arya roamed the world as a ghost, or perhaps she was dead, and Bran and Rickon, the younger boys, were rumored slain. Jon Snow held the wall, or so the ravens said, albeit struggling with the burdens of Lord Commander. That left Sansa Stark as the undisputed Stark heir in the eyes of many Northerners. She stood closer to a claim than anyone else, a claim that could unite the entire region if only the right banner was unfurled at the right moment. Peter had aligned with Lysa Arryn to secure the Vale, but that door was closed after Lysa's unfortunate accident, and the Vale Lords had begun to eye him with suspicion. He had coaxed and threatened them into submission, all the while using poor Robert Arryn as his puppet. But with each passing day, it was getting more difficult to juggle those knives in the air. Rumblings of discontent stirred among the mountain clans and the proud houses of the Vale. They wanted to see the Vale take a rightful place in the wars to come, not remain sequestered behind fortress walls. He had told them to wait, that the time was not right. Yet the time might soon pass him by if he hesitated further. Sansa Stark was his pivot. He had brought her here under the false identity of Elaine Stone, presenting her as his bastard daughter to preserve her from the Lannisters' wrath. But now he saw a greater possibility. If he allied himself openly with Sansa as a Stark, as a rightful claimant to the north, he could rouse the Vale in her name. The Knights of the Vale were numerous and disciplined, their steel bright, their armor unscratched by the recent wars. Joining her cause against the Boltons could bring swift victory, or at least a foothold for the Stark name once more. In that victory, Peter saw an opportunity not just for her, but for himself. Yet the difference, he realized with a start, was that this time he wanted Sansa to sit on a throne of her own, to see her recognized as queen in the north. He wanted to stand beside her, not above her. The cunning, the manipulations, the grasping for power, they had never stirred much remorse in him before. But now, as the wind cut across his cheeks, bringing the taste of winter on his lips, he felt that if he was to see any legacy endure, it had to be one that included her triumph. He turned from the battlements and walked down the narrow, twisting staircases of the Eyrie. Each step echoed in his mind like the metronome of destiny counting out the remaining beats of his old life. He made his way to Sansa's chambers, where she was seated before a small table in a warm, tapestry-filled sitting room. A single candle lit her face, revealing a furrow in her brow as she studied a piece of correspondence from somewhere in the north. She glanced up, startled, the wariness in her eyes a testament to the tumultuous life she had led. "You shouldn't be wandering these halls so late," he said softly. He knew her hearing was keen enough to catch the concern beneath his usual silky tone. "I could say the same to you," Sansa replied. She had grown bolder, more direct in her words. He admired that. He stepped closer. "I have news," he began, "and I would prefer to share it with you privately." Sansa nodded and gestured for him to sit. He lowered himself into a chair opposite her, noticing how she observed him, measuring him as an equal or an adversary. She had learned. "I've arranged a meeting with certain Vale Lords," Peter continued. "They're eager to reassert themselves. As you know, each day they become less satisfied with seclusion." He paused for a moment, letting the quiet weigh on both of them. "I've decided," he went on, "that it is time for you to claim your name openly, Stark." She inhaled sharply, a flicker of distrust crossing her face. "You always told me it was too dangerous." "It was dangerous, but the time has come to seize opportunity. And I believe it is the right moment to proclaim you as the daughter of Eddard Stark, the rightful Lady of Winterfell. The Knights of the Vale will rally, especially if I lend my voice in support of that claim." She studied him, her gray eyes suspicious. "Why now?" The question hung in the air. He felt himself falter, something that rarely happened. "Because," he said, after choosing his words carefully, "you have been through enough. The North needs you, and frankly, He paused again, swallowing. A swirl of conflicting loyalties and a twinge of guilt tugged at his heart. "I wish to restore House Stark, not simply as Lady of Winterfell, but, if you'll trust me, to see you crowned Queen in the North." He saw her pupils widen as she caught her breath. He knew how audacious it sounded. Lords of the North had always named their own rulers, and the Boltons had stolen that seat by cunning and blood. But in truth, those northern houses, bound by deep loyalties to the Starks, would welcome a true Stark if that Stark came backed by an army. Sansa pressed her lips together. "You want to see me as queen in the North?" she asked, voice trembling between disbelief and longing. "I do," Peter replied. For all the cunning in his soul, this moment felt strangely uncalculated. And, in his own carefully guarded heart, it felt right. She turned her face away for a moment, eyes resting on the flickering candlelight. He watched the dancing shadows across her features. "You once told me that everyone is your friend and no one is your friend, that you had no motive but self-interest. Has something changed?" Peter nodded gravely. "Yes, you've changed, and so have I in some ways." He could not bring himself to elaborate, but he hoped the sincerity in his voice would suffice. Her gaze flicked back to him, searching, uncertain whether to believe. "And how exactly do you propose we do this?" He steepled his fingers, leaning forward. "We call the Vale Lords together, ask them to muster their forces. We march to the north, gather any remaining loyal houses. Manderley, Serwyn, Hornwood, those that can still field men. Your presence, as the last known Stark in the region, will rally them. Then we oust the Boltons from Winterfell." A tremor of hope seemed to spark in her eyes, though she tried to remain composed. "The Boltons are not easily uprooted. They have Ramsay, and Roose Bolton is Warden of the North by royal decree." Peter allowed a brief, predatory smile. "The Vale Knights are fresh. They have not been bled in the War of the Five Kings. The Boltons are not beloved by the small folk, and the hearts of the northern bannermen still yearn for the Starks. This can be done." The silence that followed was heavy with possibilities. Then Sansa set the letter aside. "If I agree to this," she murmured, "I won't be your puppet. I won't be a figurehead. I've had enough of being used." Littlefinger inclined his head. "You'll be queen in truth, Sansa. I'm not here to manipulate you any longer." He exhaled, swallowing the knot in his throat. "I'm here to help you seize what's rightfully yours." She did not smile. Instead, she nodded, the resolute gesture of someone who has decided to move forward despite fears. "Then let us speak to the Vale Lords. Let us prepare to go home." He rose and extended his hand, which she accepted with a cool grip. It was the first time they had touched since leaving King's Landing. A silent promise passed between them. Peter turned to go, but before he left, he dared to glance back. Sansa's stare followed him, a quiet determination in her eyes. If ever he needed a reminder that the tides of fortune could shift abruptly, it was there in her unwavering expression. In the days that followed, the airy halls of the Eyrie filled with murmurs and rumors. Lords from various houses, Royce, Redfort, Belmore, Waynwood, arrived in response to Littlefinger's summons. They expected more talk about small affairs of governance, about how to manage the Vale's future. Instead, they found Sansa Stark, clad in a modest yet unmistakably high-born gown, standing beside Peter Baelish. The hush that fell over them was profound. Some recognized her hair, the color of Tully auburn, reminiscent of Catelyn Stark. Others had never laid eyes on her, but had heard the tragedies that befell her family. Lord Yohn Royce, who had been one of Baelish's sharpest critics, glowered with suspicion at first. His bushy eyebrows knitted together as though he smelled a trick. But Sansa, dignified despite the flicker of nervousness in her posture, stepped forward. "My lords," she said, voice carefully measured, "I am Sansa Stark, daughter of Eddard Stark and Catelyn Tully. I stand before you to ask for your aid in reclaiming my home and restoring justice to the north." A murmur rustled through the crowd. Peter observed from the edge, ready to intervene if needed. But Sansa continued, drawing a deep breath, letting her voice ring with quiet steel. "I have heard your valiant knights remain unbloodied while chaos and tyranny spread across Westeros. In the north, the Boltons have seized Winterfell and flayed loyal northerners who opposed them. The time has come for the Vale, my mother's childhood home, to help me reclaim my birthright." She paused, letting them weigh her words. Then, in a final, resolute tone, she added, "Will you stand with House Stark, as you once stood with House Arryn, and restore an order that has been torn apart by treachery?" The silence stretched for a long, measured moment. Lord Royce looked from Peter Baelish to Sansa, and back again. Peter recognized the man's skepticism, but also detected that Royce was moved by loyalty to the memories of Jon Arryn, who had been like a father to Ned Stark as well. Finally, Royce let out a breath and spoke. "We have long awaited a just cause, one that befits the honor of the Vale. If you are indeed the daughter of Eddard Stark, then you have my sympathy. But sympathy alone won't raise armies." That was Peter's cue. He stepped forward and addressed the hall, his voice quietly confident. "My lords, I have verified her identity. You know I was once of small station, but I have proven my usefulness to this realm time and again. Elaine Stone is merely a veil we placed around Sansa to protect her from the Lannisters. She is indeed the true-born daughter of Ned Stark. I stand behind her claim to Winterfell, and I ask the Knights of the Vale to rise on her behalf." A few more lords stepped forward, some with pointed questions, others with acceptance in their eyes. Lady Waynwood, older and more cautious, studied Sansa's face, the distinctive Tully features. Slowly, she inclined her head. "Should this be true, then the Vale owes a debt to House Stark. Your mother, Lady Catelyn, was once dear to us, and though the realm has changed, we do not forget old friendships easily." One by one, hands went to sword hilts, not in threat, but in solemn oath. Lord Belmore bowed. Lord Redfort pledged men. And finally, Lord Yohn Royce, though not without a suspicious glare at Peter, spoke for the rest. "The Eyrie and the Vale stand ready. Let us see the Boltons put to flight." That night, as Sansa walked along the torchlit corridors, Peter found her once more. A flush warmed her cheeks, though her expression stayed guarded. "They believed me," she whispered, relief mingling with a trembling sense of responsibility. "We'll have an army." "Yes," Peter said gently, "thanks to you, and their sense of honor." He allowed himself a small smile, noticing her pride. They stood in silence, the flicker of torches revealing shadows dancing along the walls. Sansa lifted her chin. "We must waste no time. We should move before the snows grow too thick." He agreed. "We'll march as soon as we can. Within days, the Knights of the Vale began to depart the lofty gates of the Eyrie, winding their way down the perilous high road toward the more accessible parts of the Vale. Sansa traveled in a modest but well-guarded carriage, accompanied by Peter and a small retinue. Though the journey was grueling, she looked out the window with a solemn wonder, seeing the expansive mountains and deep valleys open up before her. This land had once been her mother's refuge. Now it would be her launching point to reclaim the north. News of Sansa's open claim rippled ahead of them. A few Vale lords who had estates closer to the lowlands hurried to prepare provisions. The plan was to gather near the Bloody Gate, that formidable pass that guarded the entrance to the Vale. There, the knights would muster, form ranks, and begin the long march north along the eastern roads, circumventing the chaos in the riverlands. Peter rode beside her carriage. He wore a reflective, almost pensive demeanor, as if haunted by what he was about to undertake. He knew how treacherous war could be, how easily alliances collapsed under the weight of ambition and fear. But a grim determination also filled him. This was his path now. Perhaps a part of him still yearned for personal gain, for a place beside Sansa that would give him the power he had always craved. But another part, newly awakened, recognized that if he betrayed her now, the last remnant of his conscience would wither beyond recall. He could not let that happen. The stakes were too high, and the woman he was aiding, yes, the queen he was helping to forge, deserved better than the usual manipulations. When they reached the Bloody Gate, the sight of so many knights setting up camps in the rocky foothills stirred memories of the tourney fields for Sansa. But this was no mere celebration. Tents sprang up, cooking fires flickered under the sky. The air smelled of fresh hay for the horses and the tang of metal from the blacksmith's forges. Soldiers hammered at armor in preparation, their voices raised in songs or curses as they made final repairs. Banners fluttered, the crescent and falcon of House Arryn, the runic bronze of House Royce, the broken wheel of House Waynwood, and numerous smaller sigils. And overshadowing all was a sense of cautious optimism. The Vale, so long idle in the larger conflicts, was finally uniting under a cause they deemed just. Sansa walked through the camp, hood drawn against the chill. Men bowed or inclined their heads, and sometimes she caught the hush of their whispers. "Lady Stark," they said, "we're with you." She felt the weight of their expectations growing on her shoulders, even as it buoyed her. She had never realized, not fully, how much the common folk yearned for the Starks' return. At the command tent, she stood beside Peter as the various lords discussed strategy. Lord Royce advocated a direct march up the King's Road, but Peter advised caution. Heading into the Riverlands might risk an encounter with Lannister forces or the Freys. Better to skirt the edges, pass through Moat Cailin by lesser-known routes, and then approach Winterfell from the east, near the White Knife. They debated for hours, eventually agreeing on a slower but safer approach, hoping to avoid pitched battles until they reached the north. Sansa listened quietly, asking occasional questions that showed her growing political acuity. The men began to see her not just as a figurehead, but as a strong-willed leader who demanded clarity in plans meant to reclaim her home. By the end of the night, the lords left with bows of respect in her direction. Peter caught the quick flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. That evening, as they sheltered in a large tent arranged for her, she shared a meal of bread and roasted game with Peter, both of them seated on small travel chairs. The warm glow of lantern light revealed the weariness etched in her face. He noticed how far she had come from the naive girl who once dreamed of songs and chivalry. She set aside her cup. "The reality of war is different from what the songs used to say." He nodded. "It is. It's not a thing to be glorified. Are you frightened?" She tilted her head, considering his question with an honesty that caught him off guard. "I suppose I am, a little, but I must be brave. I can't let them down." "You won't," Peter said. "You may be the bravest person I've ever known, Sansa." It was not a typical flattery. He spoke it quietly, but with sincerity. She gave him a faint smile, a hint of warmth in her usually guarded expression. "And you? Do you regret this course of action?" He paused, stirring the dregs of wine in his cup. "No. I regret I didn't act earlier," he admitted. Perhaps I could have spared you some suffering if I had. He stopped himself. It was too much. He wasn't one to dwell on regrets. Sansa's gaze lingered on him. What's done is done, she said softly. But you're helping me now. That's all that matters. The quiet hush of night enveloped them. Outside, the bustle of the camp gradually subsided, replaced by the rhythmic clang of a distant blacksmith's hammer. Peter glanced at Sansa, her face partially in shadow, and he found himself hoping that this was not simply the calm before the storm, but rather the first step toward a better future for them both, and for the North. Dawn broke with a stirring of trumpets, and soon the army of the Vale began its march. The ridges and passes of the Vale gave way to rugged terrain, then to more open country. The roads were treacherous in places, but they pressed on. Winter threatened, each morning the ground spangled with frost, breath puffing in cold clouds from horses and men alike. Over the next few weeks, they advanced steadily, encountering little resistance, for the war-weary towns often gave them what meager aid they could spare in exchange for the promise of stability. Sansa traveled either in her carriage or atop a gentle mare, bundled in furs. Her cheeks took on a perpetual rosy hue from the cold. Peter rode near, coordinating with outriders and scouts. Occasionally, Rave and S arrived from the north with tidings of Bolton cruelty. When Sansa read those missives, a fire lit her eyes, fueling her determination. At Moat Cailin, they faced their first true challenge. The ancient stronghold, built upon swampy ground that dominated the causeway into the north, had changed hands multiple times since the war began. Word had reached them that a small Bolton garrison held it. The outer towers were in ruins, as they had been for centuries, but the causeway was narrow. If the Vale Knights had to storm it, they would lose many men. Peter gathered the lords for counsel. Lord Royce proposed a direct assault. Lord Redfort suggested a siege. Peter, however, advised sending envoys first, hoping that the garrison might surrender upon hearing of a Stark's return. Sansa agreed, though her voice shook with tension. She knew better than to trust Bolton men, but she also wanted to preserve her forces for Winterfell. The Bolton men refused to surrender at first. However, once they saw the size of the Vale host, and once Sansa's envoys cleverly spread the rumor that the rightful Stark heir would grant clemency to any who defected, the garrison commander bent the knee. They marched in, hoisting the Stark banner above the crumbling ramparts for the first time in years. Sansa stood on one of the towers at Moat Cailin, gazing north. The wind carried a damp chill from the swamps, and wisps of morning fog curled around broken stones. It was said that in ancient days, the moat's walls were tall and proud, a bastion against southern invasion. Now it felt more like a haunted relic. She sensed Peter's presence behind her before he spoke. "It will be some time before the rest of the men cross the swamps," he said quietly. "We have an opportunity to send ravens ahead. Perhaps the Manderleys or Serwins will join us on the march to Winterfell." Sansa remained silent for a moment, scanning the distant horizon. Finally, she nodded. "Yes, we'll need them. I trust that Lord Wyman Manderley remembers his loyalty to my father, and Lady Barbary Dustin might yet prefer a Stark to a Bolton." Peter studied her, noticing the tension in her jaw. "You're thinking of something else, too." She turned toward him, her expression veiled with a melancholic determination. "My brother Robb died in the south. My father was executed in King's Landing. My mother and brother were murdered at the Twins. Now I'm close to home, and yet it feels as though I'm returning to a graveyard filled with ghosts." His eyes softened. "We'll fill Winterfell with life again, Sansa. The direwolf will fly from its ramparts. The hearths will burn bright. You'll see." She let out a shuddering breath, almost a sigh. "I want to believe that. I truly do." Their journey continued northward, each passing league bringing them deeper into a world blanketed by cold and haunted by memory. Villages appeared abandoned or half-starved. Food was scarce, but local folk sometimes greeted Sansa Stark with timid hope, offering what provisions they could. She made a point of expressing gratitude, of assuring them that justice was coming. Peter watched her with a strange mixture of pride and reverence. He recalled the starry-eyed girl who once stood beside Joffrey Baratheon on the battlements of King's Landing, forced to smile through terror. Now she carried herself as if she were already a queen, and people responded to that intangible authority. In the outskirts of the White Knife region, riders brought word that House Manderly might be mustering men. It was rumored that Wyman Manderly held a secret hatred for the Boltons and the Freys for the treachery at the Red Wedding. A new jolt of optimism spread through the Vale's ranks. If House Manderly, one of the richest houses of the North, sided with Sansa, the Boltons would find themselves in a precarious position indeed. Still, winter's teeth were beginning to bare. Snow fell more frequently, forcing the men to slow their march and seek shelter. Peter insisted on keeping morale high. He distributed coin from the Ares coffers to purchase extra grain and livestock where possible, ensuring the men had warm meals. Sansa sent riders ahead with letters sealed with the Stark direwolf, inviting any loyal house to join her cause. They waited, uncertain how many would respond. One night, as they camped within an ancient pine forest, a messenger galloped in, breathless and dusted with snow. He claimed to be from House Serwyn, bearing the news that Lord Serwyn had rallied what men he could. House Glover, likewise, was rumored to have joined a growing alliance. With the Boltons universally despised, it seemed every northern house that still had men to fight was eager to see a Stark restored. The only question was, how strongly would the Boltons resist, and would they have outside help from the Crown or the Freys? Sansa read the message by firelight and passed it to Peter, who skimmed it before folding it carefully. "We must strike soon," he said, "before the Boltons attempt to call for reinforcements. The Lannisters are tied up in King's Landing, but the Freys might send men if they sense an opportunity to gain further influence in the north." She leaned forward, hands extended toward the fire for warmth. "Then we march on Winterfell directly. With any luck, we'll arrive before they can fortify further." He nodded, eyes flicking over her determined face. "And once we win, you'll be queen." He let those words settle into the space between them. She frowned slightly, glancing away. "Yes, if the northern lords consent. Though you and I both know the north does not follow meekly. They'll judge me by the success of my cause." Peter stared at the dancing flames. "We'll make it a success, Sansa. I give you my word." Several days later, with swirling snow overhead, the combined forces approached the outskirts of Winterfell. Scouts had reported that Ramsay Bolton awaited them with a decent garrison. There were flayed man banners on the walls, but none of the watchers on the ramparts seemed eager for a protracted siege in the dead of winter. Despite the falling snow, the wind was not as harsh as it could have been, and the roads were passable. It was now or never. They set up a war camp to the south, near the spot where so many armies had once rallied under Robb Stark. Knights of the Vale, along with northern contingents from houses Serwyn, Manderly, and Glover, erected tents in a wide ring. The tension was thick. The next battle would decide the fate of Winterfell. Peter could almost taste the electricity in the air, reminiscent of the final move on a Cyvasse board. A final parley was requested. Ramsay Bolton's men, sullen-faced, escorted a pale, cruel-eyed youth with a twisted smile. Ramsay wore a cloak of black leather, the edges lined with fur. When he approached Sansa's entourage, the hostility was palpable. Sansa sat astride a horse, furs wrapped around her shoulders, chin held high. Peter was just behind her, along with a cluster of Vale lords. Ramsay regarded her with undisguised contempt. "So the little bird returns home," he sneered. "Without your bastard brother, I see. And who's this? My father used to call you the Whoremaster's son. Baelish, but it seems you've grown in stature." Peter's face remained impassive. Sansa's expression was ice. "I am here for my home, and for my name," she said. "Your father seized Winterfell through treachery. I call upon you to yield it, or face the combined might of the Vale and the North." Ramsay's lips twisted into a wicked grin. "Do you think I'm so easily frightened? Winterfell is mine. And you," he pointed at Sansa. "I heard you were married to me, or nearly so, depending on how one interprets certain arrangements. If that makes you mistress of Winterfell, I'm willing to share, though you may not enjoy the hospitality." Sansa stiffened, a flash of pain in her eyes. Peter's hand clenched around the reins of his horse, struggling to maintain composure. Ramsay's mocking allusion to her near marriage, and in some variations of rumor actual forced marriage, was an insult that echoed beyond cruelty. Sansa inhaled sharply. "Your vile threats mean nothing. The North despises you. The Vale stands behind me. Surrender, Ramsay Bolton, or we'll tear down your flayed man banners and replace them with the dire wolf you've mocked." A flicker of uncertainty passed over Ramsay's face, but he masked it with a sardonic sneer. "So be it," he spat. "Let the North feast on your bones." He wheeled his horse around, accompanied by his escort, and galloped back toward the gate. That night, the battle plans took final shape. The Vale Knights, with their heavy cavalry, would form the core of the assault, while the northern infantry supported them on the flanks. Peter understood the Boltons would likely try to use the walls for defense, but the morale of their men was questionable. If enough of them deserted or refused to fight, victory might come swiftly. Sansa was advised to remain at the rear of the formation during the initial push. At dawn, they advanced through the drifting snow, banners rippling in the icy wind, horses snorting plumes of frosty breath. The Bolton men lined Winterfell's walls, crossbows at the ready. A few banners displayed the sigil of the dread flayed man, but some had been quietly replaced, an omen of the fractures within Bolton ranks. The thunder of hooves shook the air as the Vale cavalry charged. Peter rode among them, heart pounding. He had never been a warrior, but in this moment, adrenaline coursed through his veins, and all the intrigue of King's Landing seemed distant. The Bolton archers loosed arrows, some finding their mark, but the impetus of the charge was unstoppable. Ramsay's men at the gates broke under the sudden impact. As the first gate splintered, Vale infantry followed in the cavalry's wake. The fight bled into the courtyard. Inside Winterfell, the clash of swords reverberated off the ancient walls. Bolton men, some cornered, fought with desperation. Others, uncertain of their loyalty, dropped their weapons. Peter dismounted and stalked through the chaos, searching for Sansa in the swirling confusion. He had insisted she remain with a small guard, but he knew the tide of battle was unpredictable. The courtyard reeked of blood and fear, half shrouded in a haze of snow. Then, amid the cacophony, he saw her. She had just entered the courtyard, flanked by knights of the Vale. Her gaze swept the scene of bodies and warfare, and for a moment, her face registered horror. Winterfell, her ancestral home, turned into a battleground once again. But then her jaw tightened. She advanced, a silent symbol of House Stark's return. A roar erupted from the corridor leading to the Great Hall. Ramsay Bolton stood there, flanked by a handful of loyal killers. Blood spattered his leather cloak. His eyes were wild with fury. He bared his teeth in a feral grin, as though the carnage fueled him. Peter shouted at the knights to protect Sansa, but Ramsay lunged. Steel rang out. Vale swords met Bolton steel in a flurry of thrusts and parries. Peter, no master of the blade, kept his distance, trying to guide Sansa out of harm's way. Ramsay fought with ruthless cunning, wounding a Vale knight in the leg. He then locked eyes on Sansa, a manic light in his gaze. Before he could charge her, Peter stepped between them. With trembling hands, Peter brandished a short sword, far from a graceful duelist, but desperate to shield her. Ramsay's cruel laughter echoed. The meddling little spider tries to fight. How quaint. He feinted left, then slashed right. Peter stumbled, blocking awkwardly. Pain jolted through his arm. Another knight barreled in to defend Peter, but Ramsay was quick, slitting the knight's throat in a flash of steel. Blood sprayed. Peter felt his heart hammering. This was not the environment he thrived in. He was out of place. Just as Ramsay raised his blade to strike Peter, Sansa let out a cry. She had picked up a fallen spear from the ground. With surprising speed, she thrust it toward Ramsay's flank. He twisted in time to avoid a fatal blow, but the spear glanced off his side, drawing blood and making him reel. Another Vale Knight seized the moment, hacking into Ramsay's shoulder. He dropped to one knee, a snarl of agony ripping from his throat. A hush seemed to descend on that patch of the courtyard, as if the rest of the battle receded into the background for a heartbeat. Ramsay glared up at Sansa, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, his expression contorted with hatred. For a terrifying instant, Peter thought he might lash out with one last blow. But the force of his injuries was too great. He collapsed, body racked by shuddering breaths. The final blow came from a Manderly soldier, who ended Ramsay's life with a swift thrust to the heart. In that moment, the flayed man banner fell from the ramparts, replaced by the direwolf. A cheer rose up, ragged at first, then spreading like wildfire. The Boltons were defeated. Winterfell was reclaimed. Sansa stood there, chest heaving, the broken spear clutched in her hand. She was trembling, not from weakness, but from the enormity of what had just happened. Peter tried to steady her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe," he murmured. Her eyes scanned the courtyard. Dead men lay sprawled, blood staining the snow, while survivors cheered or wept. In that swirl of victory and horror, she sank to her knees. For a moment, she bowed her head, as though silently communing with the spirits of her fallen family. Peter knelt beside her, not daring to speak. Eventually, she rose with the help of nearby knights. She straightened her spine, looking around as if searching for the right words. And then her gaze fell on the battered stone walls, the old gatehouse. Memories likely washed through her. Father, mother, brothers, all gone. Yet their voices lived on in these stones, in the north itself. "Hear me," she called, voice surprisingly strong. The survivors turned, the Vale Knights, the northern soldiers, even the captured Bolton men who remained. "This is Winterfell, seat of House Stark. By the grace of the old gods and the new, I am Sansa Stark, daughter of Eddard and Catelyn, and I claim this castle as my home. Let the word go forth that the Boltons are no more. Let us build anew." A great roar of approval rose, echoing off the towers, washing away the last vestiges of Bolton tyranny. The direwolf snapped in the cold wind, a symbol of resurrection. In that moment, Peter felt his breath catch. He had orchestrated countless maneuvers for power, but none had brought a rush of raw emotion like this. He looked up at Sansa, and in his mind, she already wore a crown. They spent the next few days securing Winterfell. The battered walls needed repairs, the halls had to be cleaned of Bolton filth, and the rightful bannermen were invited to come and swear fealty anew. Sansa walked the corridors with quiet reverence, reacquainting herself with childhood haunts. The library, the courtyard, the great hall. Each step was a reminder of who she was and how far she had traveled. Peter watched her daily. He busied himself with the logistics of feeding the army and the people who had taken refuge within Winterfell's walls. He liaised with the Vale Lords, ensuring that they received their due recognition. He also began negotiations with the Manderlys and Glovers, inviting them to a grand assembly. For if the North was to crown a queen, it needed a gathering of all major houses. Winter set in more fiercely, but the fires in Winterfell's heart burned bright. The hot springs beneath the castle offered a measure of warmth, and the loyalty of the people offered hope. Slowly, northern lords arrived, often with diminished numbers after years of war. But they came with faith in the Starks. One by one, they knelt before Sansa Stark in the Great Hall, pledging their swords. Lord Manderly made the most extravagant gesture, presenting the head of a captured fry, claiming it was retribution for the Red Wedding. Though Sansa blanched at the brutality, she accepted the sentiment. The North remembered. As more houses arrived, the Vale contingent lingered, uncertain if their role was finished or still unfolding. Peter quietly ensured that the Vale's generosity and valor were not forgotten. Sansa publicly thanked them, praising their knights as the shield that protected me when I had nowhere else to turn. A wave of admiration for the Knights of the Vale spread through the northern ranks. Bridging the gap between these often isolated regions, Sansa planted the seeds of a strong alliance. One evening, after the day's meetings, Sansa summoned Peter to her solar. Snow drifted outside, swirling around the battlements. Inside, the old stone walls glowed with firelight. Peter approached cautiously, uncertain of her mood. She invited him to sit by the hearth. The gentle crackling of the flames contrasted with the cold hush outside. He noticed she wore a modest but regal gown with a fur-lined cloak. No crown yet, but it might only be a matter of time. "Lord Baelish," she began, and he felt a pang at the formality in her tone. "These last days have been overwhelming. I've had many lords and ladies come to me, speaking of crowning me as queen in the north. They say there's no one left of House Stark but me. Bran and Rickon are lost, Arya is missing. Jon Snow is still bound to the Night's Watch, if he even lives." She paused, swallowing a surge of emotion. "I never expected to lead in this way, but the North needs a Stark, and the Vale has helped secure my seat. Will you stand by me at the coronation?" He inclined his head. "Of course, my queen. It has been my honor to see you restored." She gave him a long, thoughtful look. "That's just it," she said. "You once told me that chaos was a ladder, that you wished to climb it for your own ends. Now, you've helped me climb that ladder instead. If I am queen, what do you desire in return?" The question lay bare between them. Peter felt his old instincts flare up, to craft a half-truth, to manipulate. But something in Sansa's steady gaze unmade him. He heard his own voice, surprisingly soft. "I desire to see you safe, to see you rule the North as a just queen. Let that be my reward." She studied him, as if weighing his words in her mind. "I remember when you told me I was just a piece on the board," she said softly. "But you no longer see me that way, do you?" He shook his head. "No, you've become a player in your own right, one who has outgrown my best illusions." She rose from her chair, crossing to a window where she looked out over the courtyard. "I don't know what the future holds," she murmured. "Only that I won't tolerate betrayal again. I've had too many illusions shattered." Peter stood as well, placing his hands behind his back. "There will be no more betrayals," he said quietly. "I meant what I said. I serve you now." For a moment, neither spoke. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the weight of their complicated history. Finally, Sansa turned back to him with a nod. "Very well. We will need wise counsel in the days ahead, and you have a certain knack for it. Serve me well, Lord Baelish, and together we might rebuild the North stronger than ever." In the weeks that followed, the Grand Assembly of Northern Lords gathered in Winterfell's Great Hall. It was a scene reminiscent of ages past. Flags and sigils displayed proudly despite the hardships, a hush of expectancy in the air. At the forefront, Sansa Stark stood upon the dais where once her father had dispensed justice. The hall was lit with torches and warmed by braziers. Outside, snow drifted down, but within, the crowd of lords, ladies, and knights created a buzz of energy. Lord Wyman Manderly stepped forward, his booming voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "Lords and ladies of the North, we have endured much. Betrayals, murders, the fall of our beloved king in the North, Robb Stark. But here stands Sansa Stark, daughter of Eddard, rightful lady of Winterfell, survivor of the cruelty in the South. She has reclaimed her home with the help of our Vale allies. I say we make her our queen." A ripple of agreement swept through the assembly. Lady Barbary Dustin, a woman known for her complex feelings about the Starks, spoke next. "The Boltons are gone. The Freys hold no love for us. We need strong leadership to face the coming winter. The Starks have always ruled the North. I'll bend the knee to a Stark if that Stark knows how to lead." Her piercing eyes latched onto Sansa. "Do you?" Sansa's voice carried with a confidence forged by hardship. "I have learned the price of leadership. It requires service to one's people above all else, even above personal desires. If you crown me, I swear I will protect the North, feed its people, maintain justice, and honor the memory of those who fell." An echo of "Hear, hear," sounded. Then Lord Glover stepped forward. "The Glovers remember the Red Wedding, the betrayals, the false kings. We lost much. But Sansa Stark had the courage to return and face Ramsay Bolton. The Glovers will follow House Stark once more. He knelt, pressing a fist to his chest. One by one, the lords and ladies came forward. Some knelt, some bowed. Their voices rose with a mixture of fervor and relief. "Queen in the North! Queen in the North!" The chant resonated off the ancient walls, and Sansa, her head bowed, closed her eyes as if in silent prayer or reflection. Peter stood at the edge of the dais, heart pounding. He watched this scene unfold like a dream he had hardly dared to believe. As the cries of adoration for Sansa continued, he felt a stirring within him. Perhaps pride, perhaps wonder, perhaps something deeper. At a signal from Lord Manderley, a circlet of pale silver, fashioned in haste by a skilled blacksmith, was produced. It was not ornate like a southern crown. Rather, it was simple, engraved with dire wolves running along the band. Sansa knelt slightly as Manderley placed it upon her head. The crowd roared its approval, and Sansa, her voice catching, rose as Sansa Stark, Queen in the North. In that thundering moment, Peter Baelish let out a breath. He had spent a lifetime orchestrating events to his own advantage, but now he found himself at the edge of the dais, content to watch her ascendant. For all his complicated ambitions, for all his cunning, this victory felt different. The look in Sansa's eyes as she surveyed her lords, resolute yet compassionate, convinced him he had done something worthwhile. In the days that followed, the tasks of governance began in earnest. Winterfell stores were counted and found wanting, prompting immediate efforts to procure more provisions for the oncoming winter. Sansa called councils of the Northern Lords, ensuring each felt heard. She dispatched messengers to the Night's Watch, offering them support and inquiring about the state of affairs beyond the wall. Rumors of White Walkers persisted, though some dismissed them as wild stories. Sansa, remembering the warnings from Jon's letters, did not dismiss them outright. She knew the real enemy might yet lie beyond the horizon of conventional wars. Within Winterfell, the Lords of the Vale began preparations to return home. Yet many knights volunteered to remain, citing their oath to protect the new queen. Sansa gratefully accepted their support, forging a lasting bond between the Vale and the North. Peter oversaw these diplomatic overtures, ensuring that neither side felt slighted. The cunning once used to sow chaos was now used to build alliances. He had to adapt to this novel approach, but he found a strange satisfaction in it. Sansa's coronation feast, though modest given the rationing of supplies, was filled with warmth and a sense of renewed hope. Music played in the great hall for the first time in years, a haunting yet uplifting melody. The hall was lit by hundreds of candles, their glow reflecting off plates of steaming fare, though the portions were carefully measured. Laughter mixed with solemn respect for fallen friends and family. In the center of it all, Sansa sat on the dais, wearing her simple silver crown and a fur-lined cloak. The direwolf banners hung proudly behind her. Peter was not usually one for feasts. He mingled just enough to maintain appearances, then slipped away to observe from a quiet corner. Yet as the night wore on, he found himself drawn to the dais where Sansa sat, greeting each lord in turn. At one point, she caught his eye and beckoned him closer. He approached, bowing. She gestured for him to sit near her. He hesitated, but she insisted. The lords around them watched curiously, for rumors abounded regarding the nature of their relationship and the depths of his influence. But as he settled, Sansa addressed him so only he could hear. "Thank you for what you've done," she said, "for bringing me home, for changing the game." He inclined his head, feeling oddly humbled. "I was merely a tool of fate," he said lightly, attempting to mask the sincerity of his feelings. She gave a small, knowing smile. "We both know you're more than a mere tool, Peter. But keep your counsel, keep the Vale close, and help me see the North survive this winter. There will be no shortage of threats." He raised his cup in a silent toast. "As you say, my queen." Snow continued to fall upon the towers of Winterfell, icing the ramparts and dusting the godswood with a pristine layer of white. Over the coming weeks, life settled into a strange but hopeful rhythm. Sansa gathered advisors from among the Northern Lords and the Vale Knights, forging a council that balanced tradition with pragmatic concerns. Grain shipments arrived from White Harbor, albeit fewer than hoped, and the lords began fortifying outlying keeps in anticipation of both man-made threats and the rumored terrors of winter. Peter spent many hours in the library or in quiet corners, drafting letters to distant lords, negotiating subtle pacts. He considered writing to King's Landing, but Sansa wanted to tread carefully, uncertain how Cersei Lannister would respond to the North crowning its own queen. For the moment, the North was effectively independent, as it had been under Robb Stark. Sansa was not eager to provoke another war. Though daily affairs occupied them, an undercurrent of tension ran through the castle. The memory of Bolton cruelty was fresh. Winter howled outside the gates. Ravens brought contradictory rumors. Some said there was an army of the undead massing beyond the wall. Others insisted it was a myth. The reality remained uncertain. In quieter moments, Sansa and Peter confided in each other. She still harbored doubt about the shape of the future, and he tried to reassure her while acknowledging the precariousness of their situation. In a small courtyard one evening, Sansa practiced archery, a skill she had neglected as a child, preferring needlework. Now, she wanted to ensure she wasn't defenseless. Peter watched from the sidelines, arms folded, as she loosed arrow after arrow at a straw dummy. Her accuracy improved gradually, though she was no Arya. A determined gleam lit her eyes after each shot. When she finally lowered the bow, breathing heavily, he approached. "You improve daily," he observed. She shrugged, handing the bow to a waiting squire. "I should be able to protect myself if it comes to that. Winterfell is my home, but I can't rely on others for everything." Peter nodded. "True, though you have an entire army at your command." She gave a small, wry smile. "Command is lonely, as I'm quickly learning." He tilted his head, curiosity in his eyes. "Is it not what you imagined when you said you wanted to be queen?" She looked away, her gaze drifting to the ancient walls. "When I was a girl, I never thought of being queen in the north. I dreamed of being a southern queen, in a castle of wonders, with knights in shining armor. That dream died. Now, I have a different dream. A north where families don't starve, where justice prevails, and where I never have to fear being used as a pawn again." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You have that dream within your grasp." She met his gaze. "Perhaps, with people I trust." He swallowed, feeling the weight of that trust. "Yes," he said softly. "Always." That trust was tested sooner than expected. A raven arrived from Castle Black, bearing a chilling message. Jon Snow had left the Night's Watch under mysterious circumstances, rumors swirling of him being betrayed by his own men, then resurrected by some sorcery. The wild tales contradicted each other, but one thing was clear. A massive army of wildlings had passed through the wall, supposedly with Jon's blessing, and there were urgent warnings about White Walkers. The letter implored the North to prepare, to unite against an undead threat that defied comprehension. The news caused an uproar in Winterfell. Some lords scoffed, calling it more superstitious rumor. Others took it seriously, remembering old tales from their grandfathers. Sansa felt torn. If Jon truly lived and was no longer bound by the Watch, where was he? Would he come to Winterfell? Or was he forging his own path in the savage lands beyond the wall? And if White Walkers were real, the North might need every man it could muster. A council was convened in the Great Hall. Lords Manderly, Glover, Serwyn, Royce from the Vale, and others debated the best course. Some urged to stay put, fortify, and wait out the winter. Others suggested sending forces to aid the Night's Watch or at least investigate. Peter listened intently, noticing Sansa's mounting anxiety. Finally, after hours of discussion, Sansa rose from the high seat, adjusting her silver crown. "We will send envoys to gather more information. If Jon Snow truly battles an undead army, we must learn the facts before committing men. And if the threat is real, we may have no choice but to stand with him. Whatever our differences, this concerns all humanity." A few lords grumbled, but they assented. The session ended, leaving Sansa to brood on her dais. Peter approached quietly. "You did well," he offered in a low voice. "They trust you, but I can see the worry in your eyes." She exhaled, removing her crown and setting it aside. "I can't lose everything again, Peter. Not after we've come this far. If Jon is in danger, if the North faces an undead threat, how do we prepare? We can't fight winter itself." He shook his head. "We gather intelligence, we watch the morale of our men, and we ensure the realm stands behind you. That's all we can do for the moment." She nodded, grimly accepting that reality. There were no easy answers. Days stretched into weeks. Cold winds battered Winterfell's walls. Scouts reported seeing strange figures in the distant forests at night, though it could have been brigands or phantoms of fear. Sansa pressed on with governance, sending out loyal men to rummage for supplies, to rally the smaller holdfasts. Then, at last, a band of riders approached the gates, bearing the black cloaks of the Night's Watch, or what was left of them. Among them was a tall figure clad in black and gray furs, face partially hidden by a hood. When he dismounted, Sansa's heart leapt into her throat. Jon Snow stood before her, alive, bearing scars of both betrayal and the bitter cold. The siblings embraced in the courtyard, tears in Sansa's eyes. Peter watched from a discreet distance. Jon's expression was both relieved and haunted. He scanned the ramparts, the Stark banners, the Vale Knights, and the changes in Winterfell. News of Sansa's coronation left him stunned but not resentful. If anything, he seemed grateful that a Stark now ruled their ancestral home. Jon was taken to the great hall, where a fire roared. Over a rough meal, he recounted his resurrection, cautious about the details, but the gist was clear. He spoke of the wildlings who now allied with him, of the terrifying threat beyond the wall. Some lords listened, troubled. Others deemed it an impossibility. Sansa, wearing her crown and the commanding air of the region's queen, spoke with a calm but urgent tone, insisting that Jon's warnings not be dismissed. Peter took in Jon's presence thoughtfully. He had once dismissed Jon Snow as an obstacle, a bastard who threatened Sansa's inheritance. But now, the man seemed less a threat and more an ally that Sansa clearly loved. The question remained, how would Jon's reemergence affect Sansa's reign? He caught the fleeting looks between them, siblings reunited after immense hardship, yet both changed beyond recognition. Eventually, in a private meeting, Sansa faced Jon across the old oaken table in Ned Stark's solar. A brazier hissed, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Peter hovered near the door, invited by Sansa to offer counsel, though he took care to remain discreet. Jon's voice was weary, laced with bitterness. "I was betrayed by my own men, Sansa. They didn't understand that the real war isn't against wildlings, but against the army of the dead that marches south. I can't force men to follow me. I'm not a lord or king." Sansa leaned forward. "You are my brother, or as close as any. The lords follow me, yes, but if they knew the magnitude of this threat, they would follow you too. Your experiences go beyond anything I can claim." Jon shook his head. "They'll see a bastard who deserted the Night's Watch. Even if the Watch ended my vow by killing me..." He paused, struggling with the memory. "Many won't accept that logic." Quietly, Peter interjected, "Perhaps not all at once, but if the Queen in the North supports your cause, that carries weight." Jon's gaze flicked to Peter, a brief flash of dislike, likely remembering how Littlefinger had once orchestrated events in King's Landing and the Vale. But Jon turned back to Sansa. "We need to unite everyone who can hold a sword. If we don't, the living will fall." Sansa nodded, brows knitted. "Then we must gather the northern lords again, and we must call upon the Vale. We'll also need dragon glass. Sam wrote to me about its importance. Do we have any?" Jon breathed a sigh of relief. "Some. Not enough." Peter's mind already churned with possible schemes. "We could attempt negotiations with Dragonstone," he murmured. "If rumors are true, there's still a mountain of dragon glass beneath that fortress. But we'd need to sail south, and that risks drawing the attention of King's Landing." A hush fell over the room as they contemplated the difficulties of forging alliances. Finally, Sansa rose, her eyes meeting Jon's. I won't let you face this threat alone. We'll bring the North together, and the Vale as well, to confront whatever lies beyond the wall." In that moment, Peter sensed the shift that would define the next chapter of Sansa's reign. She would not merely be a queen securing her throne from lesser nobles. She would be a leader confronting a nightmare that threatened all of Westeros. And Peter, whose life was built on manipulation and worldly ambitions, felt a curious sense of awe. This was bigger than titles or crowns. Perhaps, in helping Sansa, he had stumbled into something that transcended the petty games of southern courts. Plans were laid. Jon proposed an expedition to the Wall, to parley with the wildling forces that followed Tormund Giantsbane. Sansa would remain in Winterfell, ensuring the fortress was strengthened and the lords stayed united. Peter volunteered to ride with Jon, partly to keep an eye on developments, and partly to prove his own commitment to the cause. Initially, Jon refused, suspicious of Peter's motives. But Sansa insisted that Peter had proved his loyalty, that his skills might be indispensable in negotiating any alliances. Reluctantly, Jon conceded. Before the expedition departed, Peter found himself alone with Sansa in the Godswood. Snow covered the ground, and the heart tree's red leaves quivered in the frigid breeze. Sansa stood before the weirwood, her head bowed in silent prayer. Peter waited until she finished, unwilling to disturb her communion with her ancestors. When she turned, her expression was solemn. "You'll ride with Jon. Be careful. The far north is harsh." He inclined his head. "I'll serve him as I serve you. We need every advantage to rally men against the White Walkers." She offered a faint smile, stepping closer. "This new threat, I can't even imagine it fully, but I know we must stand together or perish." Peter reached out hesitantly, brushing his fingers against her gloved hand. "We'll stand. I promise you that." In that quiet moment, as the old gods bore silent witness, Peter Baelish realized he had found something he never sought, a sense of belonging, a cause greater than his own advancement. He was no hero, he knew, but for once, he would fight as though something more than mere ambition spurred him onward. They parted, and the following dawn, Peter rode out with Jon Snow and a small retinue of Northern and Vale soldiers, heading for the Wall. Sansa, crowned queen in the north, stood at the gates of Winterfell, clad in fur and steel, her face resolute despite the ache of watching them leave. Her final words to Peter lingered in his ears. "Come back to me with hope, or not at all." He led his horse into the swirling snow, stealing one last glance at her figure against the stone ramparts. Then he spurred his mount forward, following Jon Snow northward toward the unknown. The wind howled around them, a clarion call of ice and shadow, as they ventured toward a fate that would shape not only the North, but the destiny of all the living. Yet for Peter Baelish, the path was clear. He had chosen his side at last, and if he could help the North and help Sansa survive this gathering storm, then perhaps, for once, his legacy would be more than a tangle of treachery. It might just be redemption. For Sansa Stark, it would be the beginning of a reign challenged by nightmarish foes, but fortified by the loyalty she had inspired and the love she had reclaimed. And in the eyes of all who had bent the knee, she was queen in the north, rightful and resolute, the bright flame amid winter's dark. Jon Snow's party rode north in grim silence, the wind's wail their only accompaniment. Peter Baelish pulled his cloak tight against the biting chill, scarcely believing he had chosen to endure such hardships willingly. Once, he had thrived in the warm corridors of southern intrigue, weaving half-truths through candlelit halls. Now he found himself slogging through snowdrifts beside a man whose father, allegedly, though the rumor mill never stopped, had executed Peter's old rival and role model in cunning, Tywin Lannister. Yet here they were, side by side in a frigid no-man's land, drawn by shared necessity and, in Peter's case, by an uncharacteristic sense of duty to Sansa Stark. They had departed Winterfell at first light, a lean company of some 20 riders. Most wore thick furs, starkly black if they belonged to the Night's Watch, or else the garb of northern soldiers. A handful of Vale knights accompanied them, bearing the Falcon and Moon sigil, each of them uncertain about the environment and the mission alike. The few times Peter glanced at those knights, He sensed they might be asking themselves how they had marched from the comfortable eyrie to the ragged edge of the known world in the span of a few months. Yet none turned back. Each man felt the chill weight of Sansa's trust, and in the Vale's case, the debt they owed her for forging a cause both righteous and beneficial. Jon led them with unspoken confidence, guiding the group along hidden trails through sparse pine forests and treacherous, ice-crusted hills. His hair had grown longer, brushing the collar of the thick black cloak that still declared him of the Watch. Yet that cloak carried its own irony, for Jon Snow no longer belonged to the Night's Watch in any conventional sense. Resurrected, rumored a hush among his men. Betrayed and then somehow returned. Peter couldn't decide if it was a trick of the Red Priests or something deeper. He only knew that the man carried himself like one who had walked through death and returned haunted. The weathered lines on Jon's face bore little resemblance to the boy who once dined humbly among the Starks at Winterfell. They traveled with minimal conversation, talking wasted breath that kept a man warm. Snow crunched under the hooves of their mounts. The sky hung low, a dull gray dome threatening another flurry at any moment. Around midday, Jon signaled for them to halt in a stand of tall pines. The travelers dismounted to water the horses and chew on hard bread. Peter, brushing snow from his shoulders, studied Jon's profile as he conferred with a pair of watch scouts. One of the scouts hurried back, slipping between the snow-laden branches. A stocky man with a black beard streaked by frost, he bowed stiffly. "Lord, Jon?" The scout corrected himself, uncertain how to address one who had left the watch yet still wore its garments. "We found a decent clearing half a league north. The trees break enough that we could camp if the storm hits." Jon's expression remained grim. "We press on. Nightfall's hours away. And if the wind rises?" Jon shook his head. "It'll be worse beyond the wall. No sense cowering this side. We can't be far now from the gift's outskirts. Besides, there should be a small keepsake building we can shelter in before we reach Castle Black." The scout nodded, though hesitation lingered in his eyes. Peter said nothing. He understood that any attempt to question Jon's route would likely be met with quiet disregard. The sense of urgency was real, and Jon was a man possessed. Peter only hoped that the supplies Sansa had sent would last them the journey. They remounted. The wind gusted suddenly, blowing spindrift into their faces. Peter tightened his scarf, suppressing a shiver that was equal parts cold and apprehension. High overhead, the clouds raced, as though some unseen hand hastened them toward an unknown horizon. The land around them lay stark and empty, covered in white, with patches of hoarfrost turning branches and twigs into ghostly shapes. Now and again, they spotted lonely farmhouses, half buried in snow, abandoned by families who could not afford to wait out the winter. It struck Peter that the scope of the true north was something he'd never appreciated until he was forced to traverse it. This land, for all its bleakness, bore a fierce majesty that put mortal schemes in perspective. As dusk threatened, the terrain began to slope upward. Jagged hills formed a barrier ahead, dusted in white, with rocky outcrops that might hide anything or anyone. Jon consulted quietly with the scouts. They spoke of an old watchtower near the edge of the gift, a final vantage point before the land gave way to the actual domain of the wall. The group angled west, searching for any sign of shelter. At last, they spotted a squat structure, all but collapsed except for a half-roof of logs patched by ancient boards. It would offer little more than a windbreak. They made camp, clearing snow with boots and spades. Then they built a small fire ring near the partial roof, rigging tarps to block the worst of the wind. The horses were tethered a short distance away, beneath scraggly pines that gave minimal shelter, but at least the beasts were out of direct snowfall. The men huddled around the fire, passing a thin stew made from salt pork and whatever dried vegetables the Vale Knights still carried. There was no banter, only a few murmured thanks for the shared meal. Peter sat on a damp log, letting the fire's heat soak into his numb fingers. He glanced sideways at Jon, who was finishing a quiet conversation with one of the black-cloaked scouts. Jon wore an unyielding stare, as though his mind was fixed on nightmares beyond the next ridge. Finally, The scout moved off to check on the horses, and Peter mustered the will to address Jon directly. "How far now to Castle Black?" he asked in a low voice. Jon paused, his dark eyes settling on Peter with faint wariness. "A day if we keep a steady pace in the morning. 2 if the weather turns bad." Peter nodded. "And from Castle Black, we intend to travel north of the wall, correct?" Jon stared into the flames. "That's the plan. Tormund Giantsbane will have men around the foothills. They're fortifying a position and preparing to scout deeper. We need to find out how close the White Walkers truly are." Peter swallowed, tasting dryness in his throat. The idea of crossing through the wall into lands swarming with the dead conjured images of nightmares. "I see." And then, Jon threw a few more sticks onto the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. "Then we gather whatever forces we can. If it's as dire as I believe, we return south, unify the lords. We'll need every sword in the north to stand a chance. Maybe more." Peter nodded, feeling oddly unsettled. "You speak of it like it's inevitable." Jon finally met Peter's gaze directly. His eyes, dark and serious, seemed older than his years. "Because it is. You haven't seen them, Baelish. I have. The dead don't tire, they don't fear, and they keep coming. They're led by creatures older than your cunning, older than the petty wars we wage. They want to snuff out life itself." Peter felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. He prided himself on conjuring illusions and bending men's passions to his advantage. But how did one beguile an army of the dead? He tried not to let his discomfort show. "I believe you," he said quietly, and found he meant it. Jon turned back to the flames, as if that conversation had exhausted his ability to speak. Peter drew his cloak tighter around himself. It struck him that, in some twisted sense, everything he had done, from orchestrating the War of the Five Kings to allying with Sansa, had led him here, to a half-collapsed shack in the northern wastes, preparing to face an enemy out of legend. He forced himself to breathe slowly, reminding himself of the vow he'd made, to serve Sansa and protect her realm. If that meant braving horrors beyond comprehension, so be it. They passed a frigid night, with watchers rotating shifts to keep the fire from dying. In the early hours, Peter dozed fitfully, lulled by the hiss of wind. He woke more than once to the howling of that same wind, thinking it might be wights moaning in the dark. Each time, he reassured himself it was only the northern gale. Yet beneath the starless sky, he couldn't dismiss the sense of some vast malevolence stirring beyond the horizon. Morning came with a pale light that barely penetrated the cloud cover. The travelers rose stiffly, brushing frost from bedrolls and packing quickly. There was no talk of breakfast, only more salt pork to gnaw on and mouthfuls of near-frozen water. They saddled up and continued their march. The land grew wilder, with the ghostly outlines of abandoned crofts dotting the hills. Peter realized these were the northern edges of the gift, the land historically granted to the Night's Watch for sustenance. In warmer times, it had hosted hardy farmers. Now it stood empty, the inhabitants likely fled or starved. Shortly after midday, the sky began to clear, allowing a weak sun to glance off distant ice. Then, almost without warning, the colossal shape of the wall emerged on the horizon. An impossibly high barrier of ice that stretched east and west as far as the eye could see, shimmering faintly under the pale sun. Peter had known of it his entire life, but seeing it loom in person for the first time left him speechless. He'd visited the airy sky cells, soared above dizzying drops, but even that seemed tame compared to this titan of frozen heights. Others in the party rode forward with quiet reverence. The closer they got, the more immense the wall appeared, until its top was lost in wisps of cloud. The gate near Castle Black eventually came into view, ringed by wooden fortifications. Smoke rose from inside the fortress, only a faint trace, as the watch's numbers had dwindled. A horn blast echoed, deep and sonorous, from the ramparts. Strangers approach. Peter glimpsed black-clad figures scurrying along the walkway. They rode up to the main gate, where a pair of sentinels in black cloaks peered through the iron lattice. One recognized Jon Snow at once, calling his name in a startled voice. Moments later, The gate cranked open, revealing the bleak courtyard of Castle Black. Men of the watch, some with missing fingers or ragged beards, stepped forward to greet them with uncertain expressions. Peter felt their eyes flick over him and the Vale Knights, curiosity and caution mingling. Jon dismounted, quickly embraced by a few men who had remained loyal even after the mutiny. One grizzled ranger spoke in a raspy voice. "We thought you might not return, Lord Commander or Jon." He stumbled on the title, for Jon had renounced command, yet in the minds of many, he remained the leader they'd once followed. Jon sighed. "I'm no longer your commander, Ed." Dolorous Ed shook his head. Well, we're all that's left, so you might as well be. Come inside. Get warm." Peter and the Vale Knights followed gingerly, leading their horses to the stables. Castle Black was even more barren than Peter had expected. A cluster of wooden keeps and towers huddled against the vast wall, some in disrepair. Soldiers in black drifted about with a dispirited air, though they brightened a bit to see new arrivals. A handful of wildlings, equally ragged, moved among them, a sure sign that the old lines of enmity had blurred. Within the largest keep, they found a hall with a meager fire. Benches lined the walls, and a simple trestle table stood in the center, strewn with maps and half-burned candles. Ettalit gestured for them to sit. Other watchers gathered, wearing looks that ranged from relieved to suspicious. Peter noticed glances directed at him. No doubt they recognized him as Peter Baelish, that cunning lord rumored to have sparked half the conflicts in the south. But if they judged him, they said nothing. Survival demanded alliances, even uneasy ones. Ed pressed a cup of hot ale into Jon's hand. "We barely manage to keep a fire these days. Our fuel is running low. More of us have gone ranging north to find the free folk, or to salvage anything that might slow the others. Supplies from the south are scarce." His weary eyes flicked to Peter. "Any chance you bring help from your end?" Peter answered quietly. "The Queen in the north is mustering the region's resources, but the entire realm reels from war. We can't promise miracles. We're here to see how dire the threat truly is." Ed snorted softly. "Dire? You'll see soon enough." Jon took a seat at the table, nodding to Ed. "We mean to pass through the gate tomorrow, if possible. Tormund is waiting on the other side. We'll see about linking up with him and gleaning the others' movements." Another black-cloaked man, younger and anxious, cleared his throat. "You might not have to ride far, Lord Commander Jon." He spread a crude map on the table. "Word from the wildlings says white sightings are no more than a day's ride north of the wall. Small pockets, scouts maybe. They're heading south." Jon's jaw tightened. "Then we must move quickly." Ed's gaze drifted between Jon and the Vale men. "A small party crossing might be best. Larger groups attract attention. But you'll need men who won't break at the first sign of the dead." His tone carried quiet resignation, as if he'd lost too many good brothers already to illusions of bravery that crumbled when whites swarmed. Jon nodded. "We'll take what we can. The rest can remain to guard the gate. We can't leave Castle Black unprotected." Peter listened, resisting the urge to question the wisdom of sending a small group into the maw of an undead horde. He recalled Sansa's parting words. "Come back to me with hope or not at all." Would she consider it betrayal if he advocated caution? No, she wanted answers, not cowardice. So he remained silent, resigning himself to the next step. That evening, the watch provided what provisions they could spare: hard bread, salted meat, onions half-frozen in storage, and thin ale. Peter huddled in a corner of the hall, picking at the meager meal. The Vale Knights were in similar straits, glancing around at the smoky rafters and the men who wore the black. Some tried to share stories of southern knights and justs, but the watchers listened with polite detachment, as though such glorious pageantry were a fable from another age. Jon, for his part, remained in intense conversation with Ettalit and a few rangers, planning their route. Peter guessed they would depart at dawn, aiming to reach Tormund Giantsbane's camp by midday, if the weather held. Peter finished his meal, set the bowl aside, and made his way to the corridor. A flight of creaking stairs led him up to the ramparts that faced the wall. Outside, Darkness pressed close, but torches along the walkway revealed the sheer ice rising overhead. Peter stepped carefully, mindful of slick spots. The cold seized his lungs the moment he emerged onto the rampart. He inhaled slowly, letting his eyes adjust. The wall of ice shimmered like glass in the flickering torchlight, towering so high that the top vanished into starless sky. A parapet extended along the base, where a small group of watchers patrolled, crossbows slung over their shoulders. Peter moved to the edge, peering into the night beyond Castle Black. The land fell away into a silent expanse, black on black, with only a faint glimmer of snow. Here, he thought, all the cunning in the world means little. The dead do not bend to coin or flattery. He exhaled, noticing that even his breath froze in midair, glittering crystals of steam. He turned to find Jon standing nearby, arms folded, gazing up at the impossible scale of the wall. Peter joined him, feeling an odd kinship in the hush. "You intend to lead the scouting party yourself?" Peter asked softly. Jon nodded. "I do. No sense letting others take the risk alone. Tormund expects me." Peter tried to read Jon's expression. "If it's as bad as you say, how do we fight them?" Jon's mouth twitched, a grim imitation of a smile. "Dragonglass is one way, Valyrian steel is another. Fire seems to work on the whites, but none of it matters if they come in the numbers we fear." Peter let that sink in. "And you're certain you'd rather face them beyond the wall than prepare behind it?" Jon's eyes flashed with urgency. "We can't wait. If they march while we're still squabbling, the North will be overrun before we can unite. Sansa must know what's coming, truly know. A few second-hand tales won't stir the entire North to action, let alone the rest of Westeros." Peter nodded slowly. "Very well. Let us hope we return in one piece to deliver that message." Jon studied him, as if trying to fathom the real motives behind Peter Baelish's transformation. Perhaps a year ago, Peter might have tried to sow doubts in Jon's mind. Now, he only held Jon's gaze with quiet resolve. Eventually, Jon turned back to watch the torchlight play against the ice. They parted without further words. Peter descended to the cramped quarters the watch had assigned him, little more than a cell with a straw pallet. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by flickers of half-forgotten nightmares. The White Walkers, the courtyard of Winterfell soaked in blood, Sansa's face as she demanded he prove himself worthy. Each time he jerked awake, the wind moaned outside, and he recalled that the final game was upon them. No more trifling with illusions when the dead marched. At dawn, they assembled in the courtyard. A cadre of about 12 men prepared to venture beyond the wall. Jon Snow, Dolorous Ed, who insisted on accompanying Jon no matter his protests, 2 other rangers who knew the terrain well, 4 wildlings who joined from Hardhome, and 3 of the Vale Knights. Peter brought up the rear, ensuring their meager supplies were secured on pack horses. He wore thick fur gloves and a cloak over boiled leather, the best he could manage in this climate. The morning air was brutally cold, snapping at the skin. Castle Black's great gate loomed, a tunnel bored through the ice. Chains squealed as the inner gates were lifted, the portcullis raised. A pale glimmer of light filtered into the tunnel, revealing an eerie passage of gleaming ice walls. The horses snorted anxiously, uncertain of the strange corridor. A hush fell over the watchers who remained behind, some crossing themselves for luck. Jon led them in, hooves echoing off frozen surfaces. Peter stared in awe at the smooth ice around him, streaked with centuries of frost. A bone-deep chill emanated from the walls. At the far end, the portcullis clanked open as well, revealing the wild lands beyond. An instant later, they were through, the last barrier behind them, the empty tundra ahead. The wind struck them full on, somehow more savage on this side. The land stretched infinitely north, a barren plain of snow and jagged rock, dotted with scraggly black trees. The glow of dawn tinted the sky with a sickly pink. Peter glanced over his shoulder, noting the wall's immense silhouette behind them, as though it stood watch over a realm not meant for the living. Ahead, Jon and the 2 rangers conferred, pointing eastward. They began their journey, forging a path across the snow. Now and then, Drifts reached the horses' knees, forcing them to pick their way carefully. The wildlings, more accustomed to this terrain, guided them around hidden gullies and patches of ice that could send a man crashing into a frozen creek. Ed Tollett, despite his perpetual dourness, kept a vigilant watch, crossbow ready. The Vale Knights stayed close, eyes darting about. Peter wondered if they were regretting every moment, yet none gave voice to fear. After about an hour, they reached a low ridge that overlooked a wide valley. The land below seemed quieter than death itself, blanketed in white. The rangers paused, scanning the horizon, then angled them north by northeast. One wildling, a tall woman with braided hair the color of rust, mentioned Tormund's last known position lay near a cluster of hills shaped like a wolf's ears. Peter saw no such formation, only an endless sea of snow. Yet he trusted their word. They knew these lands, he did not. They pressed on. The cold grew more intense, if that were possible, and the wind carried an edge that could flay skin. Peter's breath burned in his chest. He forced himself to focus on each step, each breath, ignoring the creeping numbness in his toes. He resolved not to slow them down, not to be the liability. The wildlings had taught Jon's men that survival here demanded movement, vigilance, and the acceptance that comfort was a luxury. Mid-morning approached when one of the wildlings, scouting a short distance ahead, raised a hand in alarm. The party reined in. Peter's pulse quickened as he watched the scout kneel to examine something in the snow. When Jon and Ed rode forward to investigate, the rest followed cautiously. Partially buried, lay the remains of a campfire. The ashes still held a faint trace of warmth. Broken arrows scattered around, along with a few footprints leading off. Blood stained the snow, blackish and frozen. The wildling scout muttered a curse, glancing around as if expecting an ambush. Jon dismounted, crouching to run gloved fingers through the sooty remains. "Not even a day old," he said quietly. "Someone was here recently." Ed examined the footprints. Could be Tormund's group, or another band of free folk. Or it could be something else. A Vale Knight, pale-faced, cleared his throat. What else would set a fire in this wasteland? Jon exchanged a somber look with Ed. Whites can't, but there might be living men in service to the White Walkers, crazed or enslaved. Or it might be deserters from the Watch. We had more than a few run off during the Hardhome fiasco. One wildling woman pointed to the footprints leading east. Should we follow? Jon hesitated, scanning the horizon. Yes, but keep your eyes open. This may not lead to anything good. They followed the footprints in a loose column, mindful of potential traps. The tracks wound across the valley floor, zigzagging between low hills. Peter found himself gripping the reins with stiff hands, an uneasy sense crawling up his spine. The hush of the landscape made every sound ominous. Even the horses seemed agitated, snorting and tossing their heads. The sun barely provided warmth, and the sky was a flat, merciless gray. Not an hour later, they spotted a figure standing atop a small rise, motionless. Jon signaled a halt. Through the swirling snow, they discerned the silhouette of a man, tall, dressed in ragged furs. He stood too still, as if transfixed. Jon, Ed, and one wildling advanced slowly, calling out in the common tongue, then in the rough speech the free folk often used. No response. As they drew nearer, Peter made out more details. The man's eyes were wide and glassy, rimmed with frost. His mouth hung open, steam drifting from chapped lips. It was as though he had frozen where he stood, locked in some silent horror. Jon approached carefully, hand on the hilt of Long Claw. "Friend?" he called again, voice echoing in the emptiness. Still no movement. Then, abruptly, the figure lurched forward, stumbling a step. Peter's blood ran cold. He recognized that shambling gait from the rumors, Whites. A hush of fear rippled through the group. One of the Vale Knights reflexively reached for his sword. The figure came into full view. A wildling man, chest slashed open, pale eyes filmed with death. His breath puffed out in short, unnatural hisses. Jon shouted, "White!" and the watchers scrambled to form a defensive line. Yet there was only one white visible. The undead husk staggered down the slope, arms raised as though reaching for prey. Jon advanced, sword in hand, caution in every step. The wildling woman with them readied a dragonglass dagger, her face grim. Italit maneuvered to flank. The white suddenly picked up speed, half running, half lurching, letting out a guttural moan. Before it could close the distance, Jon darted forward with a fluid slash of Valyrian steel. The blade sliced through the white's torso, severing it nearly in half. It collapsed in a swirl of snow, limbs twitching as if still animated by unnatural forces. The wildling woman wasted no time, plunging her dragonglass dagger into its chest. The white jerked once, then lay still, truly dead this time. The watchers exhaled, a wave of relief washing over them. Peter forced himself to dismount, stepping forward carefully to see the creature. He'd never witnessed a white up close. The reality of it, the half-rotten flesh, the glazed eyes, made him swallow hard. Once a living soul, now a puppet of ice and shadow. No cunning could outtalk that. Jon knelt to inspect the body, grim-faced. "Fresh," he said in a low tone. "Not more than a few days since it turned." Ed's brow furrowed. Likely from the same group who made that fire. Could Tormund be close? Jon wiped his blade in the snow, sheathing it. If he is, I hope he's still alive. They pressed on, warier than ever. Peter noticed a shift in the Vale Knights. They'd followed Sansa's orders, but seeing a white up close shook them. There was no glory in slaying something so grim and twisted. Yet they steeled themselves, forging ahead, trusting Jon's lead. Before long, they found more signs of conflict. Scattered footprints, splashes of blood, a broken spear. Tension coiled within the group. The afternoon dragged on with them climbing low hills, scanning each horizon. Snow began to fall again, heavier this time, threatening to obscure their path. The wind rose, and men drew their cloaks tight to retain precious warmth. Then, through the curtain of swirling flakes, they saw movement, shadows half hidden among stunted pines. Jon halted them with an upraised hand. The watchers fanned out, forming a defensive arc. Peter felt his heart thud as he gripped a short sword he barely knew how to wield in such conditions. If a swarm of whites rushed them, could they fight them all? But then a familiar bellow rang out. "Snow! Is that you, Crow?" A large, bearded figure bounded forward from the trees, brandishing a massive axe, Tormund Giant's bane in the flesh. Relief flooded Jon's face. He gestured the group to stand down as Tormund trudged closer, wildling companions emerging behind him. Tormund's red beard bristled with ice crystals, and blood spattered his furs. He clasped Jon's arm in a fierce greeting. "I was starting to think you crows would never show. We've had a hell of a time out here." His wild eyes flicked over the Vale Knights and Peter, curiosity piqued. "Who's this lot?" Jon, still catching his breath, gestured to them. "Allies from the south, here to see for themselves the threat we face." Tormund snorted, leveling his gaze at Peter. "Southern lords, eh? Good luck to 'em. They'll need it." He spat in the snow, then jerked his head toward the pines. "We've got a few wounded. Our scouts got jumped by whites 2 nights past. Some are missing. We're holed up in a cave. Not the warmest, but it keeps the wind off." Jon nodded, eyes scanning Tormund's lines. The wildlings looked exhausted, battered. One had a bandaged shoulder, bleeding through the cloth. Another leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch. "Show us," Jon said, voice grim. The cave lay tucked into the base of a rocky outcrop, partially concealed by evergreen branches. Inside, the warmth was meager, but at least the wind did not blast through. Snow piled at the entrance in a white drift. Several wildlings crouched around a fire, nursing wounds. Tormund directed the watchers to tie their horses outside, hidden among the pines, and posted guards. Once everyone had settled, Tormund began recounting their predicament. "We meant to push farther north, see how close the whites were. Turns out they're a lot closer than we hoped. We ran into small packs, scattered at first, then bigger groups. Lost half a dozen good men in ambushes. Some vanished altogether. We fear they might come back as whites themselves. His voice held a tinge of sorrow, quickly masked by anger. Italit rubbed his forehead. We found one wandering. Jon dealt with it. Tormund nodded grimly. They're creeping south in groups. Maybe the White Walkers send them as scouts, or maybe they're chasing any living souls they can find. Either way, the big horde can't be far behind. My guess? A few weeks, maybe less. Jon's expression tightened. We need to confirm that, then get back to Winterfell and rally the north. Are there more free folk unaccounted for? Tormund's jaw clenched. Aye, some. We tried to gather them all south of the wall at Hardhome, but plenty were scattered. Some refused to cross, too proud or too frightened. I don't know how many still wander these wastes. He spat again, frustration evident. Not enough of us left to fight an army of the dead. Peter, hovering at the edges, finally cleared his throat. If what you say is true, we must bring word to the Queen in the north. Perhaps there is a chance to unify every northern house behind this threat. Tormund eyed Peter with a hard glint. You talk fancy, little lord, but you think we can beat them by playing lords and ladies? You haven't seen a white army. It'll take more than fancy words. Peter's cheeks burned, though the cold kept them numb. I've seen enough in the south to know that armies can be rallied around a cause, especially with a Stark leading them. Tormund gave a grudging nod. Aye, the king in the north was a good lad, Robb. Died too soon. His gaze flicked to Jon. Now we've got your sister. Suppose that'll do. Jon, ignoring Tormund's jab, let out a slow breath. We'll ride north for a day. We can't risk staying longer. If the main horde is close, we don't want to be caught. We need a clear picture of what's coming, and some proof to bring south. At that, Tormund's brow furrowed. Proof? Jon glanced at Peter, then back to Tormund. We have to convince the lords who still doubt. Some will cling to the idea that whites and White Walkers are children's tales. If we can capture a white, bring it back. Maybe that'll shock the realm into action. A hush fell. Peter felt his stomach tighten at the notion. Capture a white alive, if you could call it that, and haul it south? It sounded like madness, but perhaps it was the only gamble that would jar a region of skeptics from complacency. Even so, it would be dangerous beyond measure. Tormund's lips peeled back in a half-snarl, half-smile. You want to chain one of those devils and drag it to Winterfell? Sounds like a fool's plan. The kind I like best. Jon's gaze was determined. We'll pick our moment. We only need one. If we can confirm the bulk of the army is near, we slip around the edges, nab a straggler. Then we ride like hell back to the wall. Peter exhaled slowly, the madness of it sinking in. He thought of Sansa's face if she learned they planned such a risky maneuver. Yet he knew it might be the only way to fully unify the north and beyond. He tried to speak evenly. How large might this horde be? Tormund cast a bleak glance into the fire's embers. Thousands, he said. Tens of thousands. No one's counted. I just know it's more than I've seen in any wildling army. And those are only the whites. The walkers themselves lead them. Pale devils with icy spears, hearts colder than the darkest winter night. They're the real threat. A Vale Knight, perched near the cave wall, let out a shaky breath, as if trying to process that many foes. Another muttered a quiet prayer under his breath. Peter's mind whirled with the implications. The entire north overshadowed by an endless wave of undead. Even the knights of the Vale, unbloodied though they were, would be a feeble bulwark if outnumbered so vastly. Every house from the neck to the wall might be needed, and likely more from the south. The realm was battered by war and suspicion, but they would have no choice if they wished to live. They spent that night in the cave, uneasy sleep haunted by the knowledge that the enemy lurked somewhere in the darkness. Peter stood a watch shift, forcing himself to remain awake despite the bone-deep exhaustion. Wind and snow battered the cave's entrance, occasionally sending drifting flakes inside. Now and then, he glimpsed shapes moving in the night, animals he hoped, or perhaps the wind conjuring illusions. Each time, his heart clenched, expecting an onslaught of silent whites. But the hours passed, and dawn arrived without incident. Come morning, the party split. Tormund left a few wounded behind, safe as they could be in the cave, while he led a scouting force with Jon and the Watchers. Peter, Ed Tollett, and 2 Vale Knights insisted on accompanying them. One to see the threat firsthand, the other to fulfill the vow of not abandoning Jon to handle everything alone. They set out into the swirling snow, forging northeast. Tormund claimed that if the white attacks were so frequent, the main body of the undead horde must be near. Peter wrestled with the thought that they were deliberately marching toward the greatest danger. But the mission demanded it. The hours passed in tense vigilance. They found more signs. Carcasses of animals half-eaten, footprints that scattered abruptly, hints of a trail from large groups traveling southward. All the while, the wind raked across the plains, as though urging them back. But they pressed on, scanning each ridge. Finally, in the late afternoon, they crested a low hill and beheld a sight that froze them in place. Far below, in a broad, snow-covered expanse, a massive column of figures shambled south. It looked like a dark smudge against the white landscape. Even at a distance, the sheer size of it was unmistakable. Thousands of shapes, stumbling and trudging in unison. Now and then, a faint wail carried on the wind. Peter's blood turned to ice as he realized those shapes stretched back beyond the horizon. This was only the vanguard or a portion of the undead force. Tormund breathed a curse in the old tongue. Jon's face went ashen, though resolute. Ed Tollett whispered, "By the gods!" A Vale Knight gripped his sword hilt in numb shock. Peter forced his gaze to stay steady. A line from the old stories flickered in his mind. The long night, when darkness fell upon the realm. Had that dire legend returned in the flesh? Jon swallowed hard. "We have our proof," he said hoarsely. Peter nodded. "Now we just need to live long enough to show it to the rest of Westeros." Tormund pointed to the edges of the undead mass. "We might find smaller packs prowling the perimeter. That's where we could snag one, if we're mad enough to try." Jon's jaw flexed. "We are. Let's move." They circled wide, dismounting to lead the horses where the terrain got rocky. The group advanced slowly, mindful of every noise. If they attracted the notice of that undead column, they'd be overwhelmed in moments. Peter's breath came shallow, adrenaline pounding through him. His usual poise threatened to crack under the weight of real, imminent terror. Still, he forced himself onward, Sansa's face in his thoughts. Near the western flank of the undead host, they found what they sought. A handful of straggling whites limping through the snow, separated from the main mass by a quarter-mile. The question remained how to isolate and capture one without drawing the attention of hundreds more. The Watchers and wildlings conferred in hurried whispers, deciding on a small ambush tactic. If they could lure a single white away from the group, they might subdue it with dragonglass restraints. Makeshift shackles they'd fashioned by embedding sharp dragonglass shards into iron cuffs. It was a plan born of desperation. Peter volunteered to help, though fear gnawed at his belly. He recognized that a demonstration of bravery here, though rash, might further prove his loyalty to Jon, and to Sansa by extension. So he found himself lying flat behind a ridge of snow, heart hammering, as Tormund and one wildling crept forward to create a distraction. Tormund bellowed an insult in the common tongue, brandishing his axe. Immediately, a cluster of whites pivoted, milky eyes snapping to the sound. They let out guttural moans, beginning to shuffle forward. Tormund retreated, luring them away from the main column. The tension in Peter's chest mounted with every second as the whites drew closer to the trap. Once the stragglers had separated from the group, Tormund and the wildling dashed sideways, leading them toward the waiting Watchers behind the ridge. Jon and Ed rose up first, brandishing steel and dragonglass. A savage melee ensued. Whites hissed and slashed with unnatural strength, forcing the Watchers to hack away limbs and strike heads from shoulders. The stench of decay filled the air. Peter held back, short sword trembling in his grip, until one white slipped past the melee and charged directly at him. Its face was a grotesque ruin of bluish flesh. Empty eye sockets twitched with an unholy spark. Peter swallowed a shout and lunged, purely on instinct, slashing at its midsection. The blade bit deep, but the white barely slowed. Clawed at his cloak, yanking him off balance. Gasping, Peter twisted free, stumbling in the snow. Jon Snow's Valyrian steel sword came flashing in an arc, severing the white's head before it could tear Peter's throat out. The corpse collapsed at Peter's feet. Peter staggered upright, heart drumming. He saw that they'd managed to leave one white only partially dismembered, missing an arm and half a leg, but still flailing. Tormund pinned it from behind with a heavy net of chain. Ed rushed forward with the dragonglass-laden manacles, snapping them onto the creature's wrists. Well, onto the one wrist that remained. The white hissed, jaws snapping. Took 3 men to hold it still. Jon gestured urgently. We have to hurry. More will come if they hear us. Already, a shriek echoed from the distance, as if the main column sensed the disturbance. With desperate haste, the watchers and wildlings tied the thrashing white, gagging its snapping mouth with a rag. Its eyes glowed with malevolent fury, but with its limbs pinned by dragonglass spikes, it couldn't break free. Peter's entire body shook from adrenaline. The group wasted no time. 2 men hoisted the bound white onto a makeshift travois they'd prepared, ensuring the dragonglass stayed embedded near its limbs to weaken it. Their best hope was that it wouldn't reanimate with fresh vigor. Tormund scowled. We've got what we came for. Now let's get out of here before we're swarmed. They turned south, skirting the main horde's flank at a grueling pace. The white screeched into the gag, writhing, but the watchers held it down. Peter cast a glance behind them, glimpsing shapes swarming in the distance. Perhaps the undead had been alerted, or perhaps that was only the wind stirring illusions. Either way, they had no time to waste. The ride back to the wall was an exercise in terror. Snow thickened, blowing sideways in stinging gusts. The white moaned and thrashed, forcing them to stop several times to tighten the bindings. Men took turns to ensure the dragonglass restraints stayed in place. Night fell faster than expected, forcing them to seek temporary shelter in a rocky defile. No one slept properly, not with that ghastly prisoner shrieking in the darkness. They stuffed more cloth in its mouth, trying to muffle the noise. Every gust of wind felt like the footsteps of an approaching legion. At dawn, they pressed on again, half-frozen but determined. By midday, they spotted the wall's imposing outline. Relief warred with dread, for the thought of bringing a white into Castle Black was harrowing. But that was the plan, and they had no choice. When they finally reached the gate, the watchers on duty gawked in shock at the travois bearing the undead prisoner. More than one man nearly shot it with an arrow on sight. It's bound, Jon barked. And we need it that way. Let it through. Once inside Castle Black's courtyard, all present recoiled from the hideous spectacle. The white snapped and writhed like an animal infected with rabies, eyes rolling with pale fury. It took 4 men to haul it to a secure storeroom, where Ed hammered thick chains into place. A ring of dragonglass shards was laid around it, though no one knew if that would truly contain it if it broke free. The watchers retreated, faces pale. Jon sank onto a bench in the yard, breathing hard. Peter joined him, legs unsteady. Well, Peter said, forcing a shaky attempt at composure. That should suffice for proof. Jon nodded. We'll ride south at once. We can't stay here. The main army is closing in. Etalid approached, gloom etched on his features. We can't hold Castle Black against that many. We'll do what we can, but if they come in force, the wall might be the only line left. And even that. He trailed off, glancing up at the towering ice. We don't know if it will hold if the White Walkers truly wish to bring it down. Jon stood, placing a hand on Ed's shoulder. Defend it as best you can. Evacuate if you must. Light the beacons if the undead approach in large numbers. We'll rally the north. Don't throw away lives needlessly. Ed managed a weak, solemn smile. Understood, Lord Commander. Within the hour, Peter and Jon organized the return party. The Vale Knights, half in shock, longed to see Winterfell again. Anything but this cursed land of whites and ice. Tormund refused to remain idle, though he was torn about leaving any free folk behind. Ultimately, he decided to join Jon, insisting that he do his part to warn the South. "Better I break your southern lords' heads if they don't listen," he said gruffly. "I'm sick of trying to save fools who can't see past their own feuds." They prepared a sturdy cage, rigging it atop a sled harness to 2 strong horses. The White, still bound, was forced inside, thrashing and screeching. Boards reinforced with dragonglass stakes kept it pinned. The Watchers hammered nails into place, all while the White's unearthly shrieks echoed across Castle Black. Every man who heard it felt the hair on his neck stand up. This was no living prisoner. It was a herald of doom. In a small, hastily convened meeting, Jon told the Watchers, "We'll take it to Winterfell first. The Queen in the north must see it, so she can rally every house, send out ravens far and wide. Then we may need to go further south, to attempt to persuade other kings or queens. The realm must unite or perish." No one contradicted him. The Watchers offered what supplies they could spare, again not much. The party bid farewell, the gates opened, and they crossed back beneath the wall's icy tunnel into the gift. Peter felt a strange combination of terror and exhilaration. They had accomplished their suicidal mission. They had a White in tow. Now came the crucial part, convincing the living realm not to dismiss it as a trick. Could cunning and showmanship accomplish what logic could not? They set a hard pace, mindful that the undead horde might soon follow. Snow continued to fall, but the horses made better time on the southern side of the wall, where the land was slightly less harsh. Even so, it took them over a week to re-enter the settled lands of the north, where small villages stood, half empty or deserted. Everywhere they went, the Whites' intermittent shrieks sent villagers scurrying indoors. The stench of fear lingered. Word preceded them. A grim caravan with a caged monster at its center, escorted by wildlings, Watchers, and knights. In a realm already battered by war, it became a dark curiosity. On the final approach to Winterfell, the party found the roads better maintained. The snow was cleared in stretches, thanks to Sansa's efforts at ensuring supply lines. Soldiers from House Manderly or House Glover occasionally patrolled, offering salutes once they recognized Jon Snow and the Vale banners. At last, the gray walls of Winterfell rose through the gently falling snow, a sight that tugged at Peter's heart. Not long ago, these walls bore the Bolton-flayed man. Now the direwolf flew once more. How quickly fortunes changed, and how crucial the next steps would be. Trumpets sounded from the ramparts when they approached, signaling the gates to open. Sansa's guard, composed of Northerners and Vale men alike, hurried to greet them. The moment Jon and Peter dismounted, the guard asked if they had urgent news for the Queen. Jon's grim nod was answer enough. The cage bearing the White attracted startled gasps and exclamations. The guard formed a protective ring, ensuring none came too close. Inside the courtyard, Sansa stood with a swirl of fur-lined cloak, her auburn hair partly hidden beneath a woolen hood. Her features tensed at the sight of the caged White, whose guttural moans could be heard through the bars. Jon approached her first, pulling her into a tight embrace. She returned it, eyes brimming with relief. Then her gaze darted to Peter. She offered a small nod of gratitude. Her voice carried over the courtyard. "Welcome back, and what have you brought us?" Jon exhaled, turning so all could hear. "Proof. The dead are marching south. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. This thing was once a living man. Now it serves the White Walkers. We captured it to show the North what we face." A hush fell upon the assembled soldiers, servants, and onlookers. The White rattled its cage, letting out a savage hiss that made several people recoil. Sansa's face remained composed, but Peter saw horror flicker in her eyes. "Bring it to the Great Hall," she ordered. "Summon the lords, the knights of the Vale, everyone. They must see this with their own eyes." Jon nodded. The cage was dragged forward, the White snarling all the while. Guards kept pikes leveled at it, uncertain how else to respond. Peter stayed close to Sansa, offering quiet counsel. Be wary, your grace. We should have dragonglass on hand in case it breaks free. The last thing we want is a massacre in the Great Hall. She glanced at him, her features drawn taut with determination. Agreed. We'll take every precaution. Within the hour, the Great Hall was prepared. Guards armed with dragonglass spears and swords lined the walls. The cage sat in the center, its occupant flailing and hissing, eyes rolling white. Lords Manderley, Glover, Serwyn, Lady Waynwood of the Vale, Lord Royce, and a dozen other nobles filed in, their expressions a mix of curiosity and dread. The hall seemed smaller with so many present, tension thickening the air. Fires blazed in the hearths, yet no warmth could banish the chill radiating from the White's presence. Sansa ascended the dais where the old high seat of Winterfell stood, her simple silver crown glinting in the firelight. Jon took his place at her side. Peter stood nearby, half in shadow, content to let the siblings lead. Tormund, Ed, and the Vale Knights who had traveled with them gathered near the cage, ready to demonstrate if needed. One by one, the lords found their seats, muttering in hushed tones. Lord Wyman Manderley's jowls quivered with uneasy anticipation. Lady Barbary Dustin eyed the cage with open revulsion. Finally, Sansa lifted a hand for silence. My lords, my ladies, she began, her voice resonating with a calm she'd honed through trial and terror. You have heard rumors of an undead threat beyond the wall. My brother, Jon Snow, ventured north to confirm these rumors. He and his companions risked their lives to bring back this proof. Jon stepped forward, addressing the assembly. We encountered a vast army of the dead, countless whites, led by White Walkers. They are marching south. They do not feel cold. They do not feel fear. They will kill every living creature in their path. We captured this one so you could see for yourselves. He nodded to Tormund, who struck the cage's metal bars with his axe's handle. The White exploded into furious motion, rattling chains, letting out an animalistic shriek that reverberated off the high rafters. Some lords flinched. A few knights reached for their hilts. The creature thrust an arm through the bars, clawing at the air as though it hungered for living flesh. Gasps spread through the crowd, followed by hushed curses. Lord Glover rose halfway from his seat, eyes wide. Gods preserve us, he muttered. Lady Waynwood made the sign of the seven-pointed star upon her breast. Others exchanged shocked glances, faces pale. The stench of dread hung heavy. Sansa let the murmurs subside, then spoke again. This is but one. There are thousands more. The realm is in peril as it has never been before. Fighting each other will mean nothing if the dead sweep over our lands. She paused, scanning the hall. I call upon the North and the Vale to unite in full measure. We must gather every resource, food, weapons, blacksmiths, anything that can be turned to forging dragonglass or steel. We must warn the other kingdoms. Though I am queen in the North, I cannot deny we will need the help of lords from beyond the neck if we are to survive. The hall pulsed with a collective sense of alarm. Finally, Lord Manderley found his voice. Your Grace, if half of what you say is true, then the North is in mortal danger. Winter is upon us, food is scarce. How do we muster an army large enough to stand against an enemy that cannot die? Jon answered, they can die by dragonglass or Valyrian steel and by fire. We've fought whites before, and we've prevailed in small skirmishes. But we've never faced an army this size. We need to stand together. Every house must raise its banners. Train every able man and woman to fight. The Vale Knights will be invaluable. We also have wildlings who will help us. But it still may not be enough. Sansa's voice rang out. We can send ravens to King's Landing, Highgarden, Dorne, wherever a lord or lady might heed us. Even if they consider the North in rebellion, they cannot ignore this threat. It does not care for crowns or claims. It seeks the annihilation of all life. A hush followed her words. Some lords already appeared convinced. Others, like Lady Dustin, wore uncertain scowls. What about the Iron Throne's response? She asked tersely. Cersei Lannister is not known for generosity, and I doubt the Freys or their allies would come to our aid. Peter chose that moment to speak, stepping forward with measured composure. My lady, the threat we face dwarfs all previous quarrels. If King's Landing refuses to acknowledge it, they do so at their peril. But even if the Crown ignores our plea, we must not hesitate. We must fortify the north and appeal to any southern houses willing to listen. Dragons have returned to Essos. Some say Daenerys Targaryen now seeks the Iron Throne. Perhaps she will be more amenable to reason, if the rumors of her hatred for the undead are true. He paused, noting the ripple of surprise at the mention of dragons. We have to make every attempt. The dead will not stop at the neck. Lady Dustin exhaled through her nose. Targaryens or Lannisters, it makes no difference if the dead come knocking. Very well. We'll stand with you for now. But if this proves a trick... She trailed off, though the implied threat was obvious. Jon gestured to the white, which was still clawing at its cage. No trick. See for yourself. In the silent tension that followed, Sansa said, We will need your men, Lady Dustin. Yours as well, Lord Glover, Lord Manderley, and all the lesser houses. We must focus on building weapons of dragonglass. Samwell Tarly, Jon's friend, sent word that Dragonstone holds a large deposit. If we can secure it, or at least have it mined and sent north, we'll have a crucial advantage. But that may require negotiations with whomever holds Dragonstone now. Lord Royce spoke up. Last I heard, Dragonstone was left abandoned after Stannis Baratheon's defeat. If that's so, it may be empty. We could send ships from White Harbor with permission. Lord Manderley stroked his chin. White Harbor can spare a few ships. Not many, but enough for an expedition. We'd need men skilled in mining or at least in cutting stone. It would be a gamble in these waters with winter storms. Jon nodded. Still worth the risk. We'll also gather the free folk who have already crossed the wall. Their leader, Tormund Giantsbane, is here. They know how to survive in harsh conditions. We'll muster them alongside our forces. A brief wave of tension passed as some older lords recalled centuries of conflict with wildlings. But seeing the white thrash in the cage, it was hard for them to maintain old prejudices. The final threat overshadowed all. Sansa surveyed the room, noting each lord's expression. We have little time, she said. The dead march south. We must fortify Winterfell as our central stronghold, reinforce Moat Cailin, and use it as a fallback if needed. Gather all the grain and livestock we can. We'll prepare for a siege, but also for a field battle if the undead break through. Lord Royce, I ask the Vale to maintain a strong presence. Your knights are the freshest force in Westeros. Will you stand with us? Royce's rugged face drew tight. The Vale heeds your call, your grace. We have not forgotten how we reclaimed Winterfell together. If we must face an enemy from beyond the grave, so be it. A wave of relief passed over Sansa's features. She inclined her head. Thank you, my lord. Let us begin at once. Dismissed. The lords rose, murmuring among themselves. Several cast fearful, fascinated glances at the caged white as they departed. Servants and guards moved in to drape a heavy covering over the cage, muffling its hateful shrieks. Peter exhaled, tension draining from his shoulders. The demonstration had worked, at least for now. They had ignited the North's fear, which might galvanize it into united action. Jon turned to Sansa, a quiet gratitude in his gaze. We should talk strategy, see how best to deploy forces. There's much to do. She nodded, pressing a hand to his arm. Agreed. And I'm glad you've come back safely. Thank you for showing everyone the truth. We'll need your presence here, your experience with the Watch. Tormund, standing off to the side, scratched his beard. You have any good ale in this castle? We could all use a drink after that showing. Sansa managed a wry smile. I'll see what can be spared. As the hall began to clear, Peter lingered, noticing Sansa's gaze drifting toward him. She descended from the dais, motioning for him to follow. They walked quietly out of the great hall, weaving through corridors until they reached a smaller antechamber that overlooked the courtyard. The hush of the castle enveloped them, Outside, snow fell softly, layering the stones. When they were alone, Sansa turned to face Peter. For a moment, neither spoke. He saw an intensity in her eyes, a mingling of relief and anxiety. Finally, she said, "You did it. You went beyond the wall and came back alive. I was afraid. Well, I feared the worst." He dipped his head. "I won't lie. It was the most perilous thing I've ever done. But I had good men with me. Jon was crucial. Without him and the wildlings, we wouldn't have returned." Sansa folded her arms, looking away, her voice dropping. "I've tried so hard to maintain strength here, to show no sign of weakness. But each day, it felt like the North was fraying at the edges. House Dustin resents me. House Glover wavers. House Manderley is eager but also cautious. Now they've all seen the threat. Perhaps they'll stand together. Perhaps." Peter took a cautious step closer. "I believe they will. Fear can be a powerful motivator, and in this case, it's not an illusion. The dead are real, and your leadership is their best hope." She studied his face. "You've proven your loyalty more times than I expected, Peter. And now you've risked your life in a cause that has no easy profit. You could have stayed safely in the Vale." He swallowed. "I pledged to serve you, and I meant it." She reached out, hesitating only a moment before resting her hand on his arm. "I'm grateful, truly. I'll need you as we gather allies, draft letters, handle the negotiations. If it comes to seeking outside help, even from Daenerys Targaryen, I'd prefer to have someone with your experience in politics." Peter nodded, tension in his throat. "Of course, whatever you require." Sansa's expression softened, a rare warmth flickering in her gaze. "I never thought we'd stand on the brink of a war against the dead, with me as queen and you as my counselor. But here we are." He dared a subtle smile. "Sometimes the strangest roads lead to the right place." A faint smile touched her lips in return, though sadness lingered behind it. "Let's hope we find a way to survive this winter together." They stood for a moment in silence, the only sound the distant cries of ravens in the courtyard. Snow swirled beyond the windows, painting the bleak tapestry of the North's long night. In that stillness, Peter Baelish felt a surge of resolve. All his life, he'd thrived by exploiting chaos, but for the first time, that chaos threatened to devour the entire world. He had chosen his place in this struggle. At Sansa Stark's side, forging alliances for the living, gambling on the fragile hope of redemption. Outside, ravens were already taking flight, bearing letters to lords near and far. The words within spelled out a dire warning. The dead are coming, and Winterfell stands as the first bastion of life. Unite or perish. It was a call to arms unlike any the realm had known. King's Landing might laugh it off or ignore it, or see it as a ruse. Daenerys Targaryen, if the rumors were true, might meet them with dragons. The Riverlands and the Stormlands might be too war-torn to lend aid. No matter, the North would not wait for Southern acceptance to defend itself. In the days that followed, Winterfell became a hive of relentless activity. Blacksmiths toiled night and day, forging arrowheads and spear tips from the small stock of dragonglass that had been transported from Hardhome by Jon's allies. Scouts roamed the roads, coordinating with Manderley convoys to launch the expedition to Dragonstone. Stores of grain were inventoried, local villages scoured for supplies. Scribes worked tirelessly in the library, drafting pleas for help to every corner of Westeros. Sansa presided over strategy sessions, deploying men to reinforce Moat Cailin and the White Knife approaches. She commanded the lordlings with a calm authority that made Peter proud to stand at her side. Jon Snow, for his part, oversaw training in the courtyard. He had men drilling with dragonglass-dipped weapons, taught them how to strike a wight's limbs, how to hold the line against creatures that felt no pain. Tormund Giantsbane, a ferocious presence, roared instructions at recruits who gawked at the idea of a wildling leading them. The Watchers who had come south continued to share all they knew about the enemy's weaknesses. More free folk trickled in from beyond the wall, telling harrowing tales of fleeing the undead. They, too, took up places in Winterfell's muster, forging an unlikely community of northerners and wildlings. In quiet corners, Peter guided Sansa on matters of diplomacy, reminding her of which southern houses might be most receptive, which lines of approach might yield better results. She listened carefully, weighing his suggestions without blindly following them. Proof that she was her own master. He felt a certain pride in that. Though his cunning had once been used for personal gain, here it might mean the difference between survival and extinction for thousands of innocents. Night after night, the lords gathered in Winterfell's halls, discussing positions of watchtowers and outposts. Some suggested building more defenses at the last hearth, seat of the Umbers, but the Umbers had been decimated by the Boltons. Others proposed trying to retake the Dreadfort for a strategic advantage, but Sansa dismissed that as wasted effort. Every soldier was needed at the front lines. They had no illusions. If the undead came in full force, no single castle would hold them indefinitely. The best plan was to combine armies, concentrate power, and hope the living had enough strength to stand. As the weeks wore on, the caged wight remained locked in Winterfell. El's dungeon, subdued by dragonglass shackles, trotted out occasionally when a new arrival doubted the severity of the threat. Each time, it shrieked and clawed, an unholy testament. Some men, upon seeing it, nearly fainted. Others swore oaths of fealty to Queen Sansa on the spot, vowing to fight until their last breath. Fear of death, Peter reflected, could unify men in ways hope alone never did. Ravens began to return with scattered replies. Some messages from the south arrived too late or missing entire passages, as though tampered with. A short, tense note from King's Landing bore the Queen Regent's seal, dismissing the northern claim as fabrications from a false queen who dares defy the crown. Sansa read it with a grim expression, then cast it aside without comment. Other replies were more sympathetic but offered little immediate support. War-weary lords were reluctant to march north at the onset of winter. The most promising rumor was that Daenerys Targaryen had landed on Dragonstone with her army and dragons, though no direct response to Sansa's ravens had been received yet. Peter guessed the would-be queen of the Seven Kingdoms had her own priorities, but perhaps the time would come when common cause against the undead overshadowed all else. Despite the swirling complexities, day by day, Winterfell's readiness improved. Walls were repaired, archers drilled, supplies stored. The morale was guarded but resolute. Peter often found himself in the library, cross-checking old texts for references to the Long Night, the mysteries of Dragonglass, or any hidden lore that might help. In those dusty tomes, he found scattered tales of heroes from the Age of Heroes, Bran the Builder, the Night's King, Azor Ahai. Much was lost to legend. Still, he gleaned that unity had once saved the realm. Perhaps it could again. Late one afternoon, as the sun cast a pale glow over the yard, Peter stood in conversation with Sansa near the battlements. She wore a heavy fur cloak, her cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes surveying the bustling courtyard below. Soldiers carried barrels of salted meat, others sharpened spears. In a corner, Tormund bellowed instructions at a group of fresh recruits. "You've accomplished so much in a short time, Your Grace," Peter commented. "Seeing this castle restored to purpose warms even my old heart." Sansa allowed a faint smile. "It's a start, but winter is closing in fast. The undead may be weeks away, months if we're lucky, but no one can say for certain. Jon's watchers beyond the wall have sent fewer and fewer ravens, as if even they are in retreat." Peter gripped the stone parapet. "We must be prepared for the worst. But know this, if we hold the north together, if we rally the Vale, if the southern lords come to their senses, we might stand a chance. You have done more than anyone thought possible." She considered his words, then turned to face him directly. Her gaze was steady, the cool wind whipping a stray tendril of auburn hair across her cheek. "I've not forgotten how I arrived here, your schemes, your manipulations, but also your help, your willingness to change course. You've given me the means to become what I am. So I ask you now, are you truly with me, no matter what comes?" The question hung in the brittle air. Peter felt the weight of it. He recalled the ghosts of his past. Catelyn Tully, the heartbreak that drove him to chase power, the reckless gambles that toppled kings. But all that paled against the tide of the undead. Now everything hinged on standing firm. He straightened, meeting her gaze. "Yes, Sansa," he said, letting the formality slip. "I'm with you until the end." Something like gratitude shone in her eyes, tempered by caution. "Very well. Then help me see this through. We will not let the dead take our home. We will not let the North become their graveyard. And if we succeed, perhaps we can create a realm that no longer breeds betrayals and slaughter." Peter nodded, swallowing a surge of emotion. "A realm built on justice," he said quietly. "Your realm, my queen." Their pact, so fragile yet vital, was sealed anew in that moment. As they stood against the ramparts of Winterfell, the sun dipped behind gathering clouds, a prelude to another snowfall. The hush of oncoming twilight seemed to whisper of a future uncertain and fraught with dangers. Yet for the first time in his life, Peter Baelish, the master of cunning and betrayal, felt the stirrings of genuine resolve. He would fight for Sansa Stark's cause as though it were his own life at stake. Because it was, and not just his life, but the lives of countless souls across Westeros. Days turned to weeks, the snows deepened, and ravens came and went with conflicting tidings. The undead host loomed somewhere beyond the horizon, unstoppable in its slow march. Meanwhile, Sansa tightened alliances with House Manderly, House Glover, House Serwyn, even coaxing reluctant pledges from holdfasts that had once sworn to the Boltons. She pored over maps, dispatching scouts to man vantage points along the King's Road, near the Last Hearth and beyond. Jon led patrols that ventured north to track white movements. Tormund, half impatient for the fight to begin, helped integrate wildling warriors into the ranks. The entire castle braced for the clarion call that would signal the ultimate test. Finally, one bleak morning, a raven arrived bearing tidings that the first wave of undead had been sighted near a place called Queen's Crown, not far beyond the Gift. A smaller force, perhaps a detachment or outriders for the main horde, had ventured south. Their approach was methodical and swift. Winterfell's time was running out. Sansa summoned her war council. The lords assembled in the great hall. Peter stood behind her, hands clasped, as the news was read aloud. A collective shiver rippled through the gathered. This was it. The war of the living and the dead would commence. Outside, the snow fell in thick curtains, muffling the world in white. Soldiers hurried along the battlements, reinforcing wooden hoardings, stacking barrels of pitch and oil for flaming arrows. In the courtyard, archers tested their bowstrings, steam rising from anxious horses. The caged wight howled in the dungeons, as if anticipating its brethren. Peter watched from a window, feeling the tension coil in his stomach. For all the cunning he possessed, for all the alliances they had painstakingly assembled, victory was far from certain. Sansa paced the great hall, draped in a thick cloak of direwolf fur. Jon conferred with the northern lords, finalizing the plan of defense. A large host would meet the undead near the outskirts of Winterfell, using the castle's strong walls as a fallback point. Archers on the battlements would rain flaming arrows and dragonglass-dipped quarrels upon the whites. Infantry armed with dragonglass spears would stand in disciplined ranks. Should the outer defenses fail, they would retreat into Winterfell's walls, where more defenses awaited. As Peter listened, he recognized that the scale of the battle might dwarf anything the North had witnessed since the War of the Five Kings. The difference was, they now faced an unrelenting enemy that could not be intimidated. They had to kill every last wight or be overrun. Evening fell, bringing a somber hush. Sansa stood at the gates of Winterfell, addressing the ranks of soldiers by torchlight. Her voice carried across the silent courtyard, lit by flickering flames. She spoke of House Stark's legacy, of the need to protect the living from a threat older than any house rivalry. She promised them that if they stood firm, they would carve their names in history as the saviors of the realm. Peter could see the fear in many faces, yet he also saw a spark of hope. Fear and hope mingled, forging a desperate determination. Jon Snow stood beside her, echoing her call for unity, reminding the men that the real enemy was at their doorstep. Tormund bellowed that he would happily strike down 100 whites before letting them cross the threshold. The courtyard shook with cheers, a raw noise of defiance in the face of certain horror. Then, as the torches guttered and men dispersed to their posts, Sansa and Peter found themselves alone under the portcullis. The wind sliced through, swirling snow around them. In the flickering light, her features looked both regal and vulnerable, the silver crown almost hidden by her fur hood. Peter bowed slightly, a gesture of respect. She reached out, her gloved fingers brushing his cheek. "If we don't live through this," she murmured, "I want to thank you now." He swallowed, covering her hand with his own. "We will live," he said quietly, as if daring to speak it into reality. "You are the queen in the north, and the north remembers. We will not let the dead triumph." She nodded, lowering her hand. "Go, prepare yourself. Tomorrow or the day after, the enemy arrives." Peter bowed once more, turning to take his place among the defenders. As he walked away, the swirling snow veiled Sansa's figure, leaving only the distant torchlight and the promise of the final stand. Whatever happened in the coming days, Peter Baelish, once Littlefinger of the Fingers, once a self-serving architect of chaos, would meet it at her side, heart steeled, cunning bent not toward personal gain but toward preserving the life he had come to cherish. High on Winterfell's battlements that night, Peter watched the horizon. The snows had lessened, leaving a stark black sky studded with cold stars. The hush was absolute. Somewhere out there, an army marched, an army that did not breathe, did not rest, driven by an icy malevolence older than men's pride. Yet here, behind the walls once held by House Stark for generations, a new queen awaited, backed by lords and knights, wildlings and watchers, guided in part by a man who had once thrived on betrayal. In the hush before the storm, Peter Baelish felt more alive than he ever had, alive with purpose, with the quiet certainty that this time, his cunning served more than just his own ambition. It served the living themselves. And so began the final vigil, the last days of uneasy calm before the Night King's shadow fell upon Winterfell. Whether dawn would bring a new era or eternal darkness, none could say. The realm balanced on a sword's edge, every heartbeat a countdown to cataclysm. Yet even in such a dire hour, Sansa Stark's banner, the dire wolf of House Stark, flew high against the moonlit sky, proclaiming to all that the North had a queen who would stand unbowed, and at her side, a redeemed knave whose greatest gambit would be to save Westeros itself.